A dispatcher noticed an odd pattern during the blizzard. The winter of 1988 brought a storm that locals still talk about during every single heavy snow alert. Records from the county dispatch office show that emergency calls tripled within the first 4 hours of the whiteout conditions. Silas Vance was 42 years old and worked as a senior dispatcher for the rural Mountain Valley Emergency Services. He had spent 12 years answering phones, but nothing prepared him for the chaos of that specific Tuesday in January. Silas arrived at the station before dawn, while the first flakes were just beginning to cover the dark asphalt roads. His goal for the shift was simple, since he just wanted to keep the radio channels clear for the plows. The wind picked up around 10 o'clock, and visibility dropped to near zero across the entire northern half of the valley. The first strange call came through at noon from a woman who reported a stalled sedan on a back road. She told Silas that she saw a man in a red jacket walking away from the car toward the woods. Silas logged the location and sent a deputy, but the officer found the car was empty and completely locked up. The deputy reported that there were no footprints leading away from the vehicle despite what the witness had just claimed. Silas assumed the snow had simply filled the tracks in quickly because the wind was gusting at 40 miles an hour. An hour later, another call arrived from a different part of the county regarding a man in a red jacket. This witness was an elderly farmer named Arthur, who claimed he saw someone standing in the middle of his field. Arthur said the figure was not moving at all despite the freezing temperatures and the blinding sheets of heavy snow. Silas checked the map and realized this farm was nearly 15 miles away from the first sighting of the sedan. It was impossible for someone to travel that distance on foot through a blizzard in such a short amount of time. The dispatcher began to feel a sense of unease as he looked at the blinking lights on his console screen. He decided to pull up the digital logs from the previous winter storms to see if this pattern had appeared. Dispatchers often share stories about ghost calls or strange sightings during heavy weather, but Silas usually ignored that kind of talk. He noticed a note in the archives from 1983 that mentioned a red jacket near a frozen creek bed. The similarities were enough to make him sit up straight and reach for his cold cup of black morning coffee. A third call interrupted his thoughts when a local gas station attendant reported a silent person standing by the pumps. The attendant described the individual as wearing a bright red coat that looked far too thin for the sub-zero weather. Silas asked the caller to approach the person, but the attendant refused because the stranger was behaving in a way. The person supposedly turned toward the shop window and just stared with an expression that the caller described as empty. When the deputy arrived 5 minutes later, the parking lot was empty and there were no signs of any visitors. Silas started plotting these points on a paper map of the valley to see if there was a physical connection. He used a red pen to mark the sedan, the farm, and the gas station while checking the exact times. The points formed a perfect straight line that cut across the most dangerous and uninhabited parts of the rugged mountain. This line did not follow any existing roads or hiking trails, which made the speed of the sightings even more. Silas felt a chill that had nothing to do with the drafty windows of the old dispatch center building office. He reached out to a retired dispatcher named Vance who had worked in the valley for over 35 years. Vance listened to the description of the red jacket and stayed silent on the other end of the phone line. The older man finally whispered that Silas should look at the logs from the Great Blizzard of 1972. Silas searched the basement archives and found a dusty folder containing handwritten notes from a very long night in December. He found a report about a missing surveyor who vanished while wearing a distinctive red parka during a record storm. The surveyor was named Elias, and he had been tasked with marking the boundary for a new high-voltage line. According to the old dispatch logs, Elias had sent a final radio transmission about getting lost in the whiteout conditions. Search teams looked for him for 3 weeks, but they never found a single trace of his gear or body. The line Silas had drawn on his map matched the exact path of the proposed power lines from that era. Every sighting from this afternoon was located at a spot where a massive steel utility tower currently stood in silence. Silas realized the figure was not walking between the locations, but was appearing at specific points along the electrical grid. He received one final call as the sun began to set behind the thick gray clouds of the dying storm. A homeowner near the end of the valley reported a man in a red jacket standing on her back porch. She said he was tapping on the glass and holding up a surveyor rod as if he were taking measurements. Silas told her to stay away from the windows and dispatched the nearest unit with a sense of urgent dread. The deputy reached the house in record time but found only a pile of snow leaning against the wooden door. There were no boots prints on the porch, and the homeowner was hiding in her bathroom with a loaded shotgun. Silas looked at his map one last time and saw the final point ended at the local main power substation. He called the utility company to warn them, but the technician said the gates were locked and the alarms silent. The storm finally broke around midnight, and the wind died down to a soft whistle through the frozen pine trees. Maintenance crews went out the following morning to clear the ice from the heavy lines near the primary mountain substation. They found a vintage surveyor rod leaning against the fence and a scrap of red fabric caught in the wire. There was no body found in the drifts, and no evidence that anyone had climbed over the high-security fence. Silas kept the scrap of fabric in his desk drawer as a reminder of the pattern he found that day. He never spoke about the red jacket again, but he always watched the monitors closely whenever the snow started falling. The valley remained quiet for the rest of the winter, and the strange calls did not return to the station. Experts say that sensory deprivation during blizzards can cause groups of people to imagine similar things out of thin air. Silas knew the difference between a tired mind and a factual log of events recorded in real time on paper. He retired 3 years later and moved to a coastal town where it never snows and the sun always shines. The records of 1988 remain in the basement for the next person who might notice the strange pattern. The county museum eventually displayed a small exhibit about the surveyor who disappeared so many long decades ago in the cold. Visitors often stop to read the official reports from that night, and they wonder about the man in the red coat. Some believe that the energy from the high voltage lines acted as a conduit for a soul lost in time. Others think that the extreme weather simply bends reality in ways that the human mind cannot ever fully understand or explain. The dispatch office still uses the same map system, but the younger workers do not know about the red ink. Silas spent his final days sitting on a porch by the ocean while reading books about geography and local mountain history. He often thought about the surveyor Elias and hoped the man finally found the boundaries he was looking for that night. The red fabric in his drawer eventually faded to a dull pink, but the memory of the tapping glass remained. He knew that some mysteries are not meant to be solved by police officers or by professional search and rescue teams. The blizzard of 1988 remains a legend that grows larger every time the temperature drops below the freezing point. The station logs were digitized in the year 2010, but some of the original handwritten notes were lost during the process. Silas had made sure to photocopy the most important pages before he left the valley for the very last time ever. He sent those copies to a historical society so that the truth of the pattern would not be forgotten by history. The surveyor rod found at the substation remains in a glass case as a silent witness to a very strange afternoon. No one has seen the man in the red jacket since the power grid was upgraded in the early 90s. The wind still howls through the mountain passes, and the snow still buries the small towns under feet of frozen white powder. Every dispatcher who sits at that desk now hears the faint static on the radio during the height of a storm. They look at the screens and they watch for any calls about a man walking alone where no man should be. The legacy of the red jacket is a part of the valley now, and it will be for a long time. Silas Vance died peacefully, knowing that he had documented the impossible with the steady hand of a true professional worker. This photo was recovered after everyone disappeared. The discovery of a high-resolution camera at the bottom of a shallow ravine changed the entire investigation into the missing group. A park ranger found the device while clearing brush near the edge of a popular lookout point in the late autumn. The memory card inside was perfectly preserved despite the harsh weather conditions and the physical damage to the heavy metal casing. It contained a series of photographs that documented the final hours of 4 experienced hikers who seemed to vanish without trace. Harlan Vance was a 36-year-old commercial pilot who had spent his entire life navigating the rugged coastal ranges. He arrived at the trailhead early on a Friday morning with his 3 closest friends for a planned weekend mountain trek. The weather was predicted to be clear and cool, but a sudden wall of fog rolled in from the Pacific Ocean. Harlan carried a professional digital camera to document the rare flora and fauna that lived along the high-altitude rocky ridges. The forest was dense, and the air felt damp as the group started their climb toward the summit of the peak. As the group moved higher, they encountered a strange field of scorched grass that formed a perfect circle in the clearing. Harlan stopped to take several photos of the area while his friends checked their compasses, which were spinning in useless circles. They followed the path until they reached a limestone ledge that overlooked a deep valley filled with a thick violet mist. The camera recorded the group looking over the edge with expressions of confusion as they noticed a structure in the trees. Harlan noticed that the shadows on the ground were moving in the opposite direction of the sun during the afternoon hours. He decided to lead the group toward the structure to find shelter as the temperature began to drop below the freezing point. The camera captured a strange shimmer in the air that looked like heat waves rising from the cold and damp ground. A series of photos showed the hikers standing in front of a metallic doorway that was built directly into the cliffside. Harlan took a close-up shot of a control panel that featured symbols that did not match any known human language. He found a small button on the side of the panel, and the doorway opened with a silent and smooth motion. According to local archives, several people had reported seeing strange lights hovering over this specific ridge since the 1950s era. Dispatch logs from the night the group disappeared indicate that multiple residents heard a low-frequency hum coming from the mountain. Search teams arrived at the ledge 3 days later, but they found no signs of the hikers or their heavy packs. They found the camera sitting on a rock, but the tripod had been melted into a puddle of unrecognizable dark glass. Harlan had managed to trigger a burst of photos just as the group entered the dark tunnel behind the metallic door. The investigators downloaded the files and noticed a disturbing pattern in the timestamps of the final 12 images on the card. Each photo was taken exactly 1 second apart, but the position of the stars in the background shifted by several hours. A figure that was not part of the original group appeared in the corner of the frame during the last shot. The person looked like a man wearing a vintage flight suit from the 1940s, but his face was completely blank. He stood with his arms at his sides, while the hikers seemed to be frozen in place by an unseen force. The narrator of the official report described how the camera picked up a bright flash that washed out the entire sensor. Witness statements from a nearby observation post mentioned a beam of blue light that shot into the sky at that time. Harlan Vance was heard on a nearby radio frequency for a few seconds before the signal was cut off by static. He claimed that the room inside the cliff was much larger than the mountain itself and was filled with thousands of lights. The humming was reportedly so intense that it caused the lenses of the binoculars to shatter inside the padded carrying cases. The sheriff listened closely to the audio recovered from a small digital recorder that was also found near the damaged camera. Harlan stopped speaking for several seconds, and the only sound on the tape was a rhythmic clicking that sounded like a clock. The pilot whispered that the man in the flight suit was pointing toward a map of the stars on the wall. He claimed that the map was moving and showed the Earth becoming smaller as the group was lifted off the ground. The clicking was persistent and moved from the recorder toward the entrance of the tunnel with a very rapid pace. The investigation into the disappearance of the group originally concluded they were victims of a sudden landslide or a tragic fall. However, the details in the recovered photos suggested that the group had stepped into a place where time did not function. Harlan had documented a physical transition from the mountain trail into a facility that should not have existed on any map. The sheriff paused the slideshow and looked at the final image, which showed a hand reaching for the camera from above. He felt a chill run down his spine as he realized the hand had 6 long and slender fingers with translucent skin. The final few frames on the memory card contained a distorted image of the valley as seen from a great height. Harlan managed to capture the trailhead where they had parked their car, but the vehicles looked like tiny toys in the distance. He mentioned in the audio that the air felt thin and tasted like ozone and burnt hair as they were moved. The recording ended abruptly with a loud pop and the sound of a vacuum sealing a container shut in the dark. Silence filled the evidence room as the investigators realized that the group was no longer on the mountain or the Earth. The authorities contacted a government agency that specialized in unexplained aerial phenomena to examine the metallic door and the control panel. A researcher named Silas Vance arrived at the site but found that the entrance had been replaced by solid and gray limestone. They returned to the ledge with ground-penetrating radar, but the results showed only solid rock for hundreds of feet in every direction. The desert seemed empty under the moonlight, but the feeling of a heavy and cold presence remained in the mountain air. They found a single silver button near the spot where the camera was recovered that felt warm to the touch. The photos showed blurry images of a hangar that contained several craft shaped like polished silver needles resting on the floor. One image captured Harlan looking into a mirror, but his reflection showed a man who was much older, with white hair. Silas noted that the silver button had the same symbols found on the control panel in the earlier photos on the card. They realized that the hikers had not just disappeared, but had been taken to a place where they would never age. The symbols on the button began to glow with a soft blue light when the men spoke the name of Harlan. The case remains open, but the physical evidence is kept in a vault that requires a high level of security clearance. The families of the 4 hikers often visit the trailhead to leave flowers and look at the peaks with a sense of loss. The camera serves as a haunting reminder that some places in the wilderness are not meant to be mapped by human hands. Harlan no longer flies his plane over that section of the range because his instruments always fail when he nears the ledge. The mountain remains a silent witness to the events of that night, while the photos hold the only proof of the truth. Today, no search team members dare to return to the area without full backup communication gear and armed security personnel. Silas Vance spends his nights analyzing the frequency of the hum recorded in the audio to find any hidden messages. He discovered the sound patterns match star transmissions caught by radio telescopes in other parts of the world at the same time. This suggests that whatever happened on that mountain has links to something far beyond our understanding of space and time. The silver button is kept in a lead container because it emits unstable energy that affects all nearby electronic devices. Local residents still report seeing pillars of blue light rising from the peaks whenever fog storms settle in the northern valley. Some believe the hikers are still alive and traveling among the stars on a mission that we cannot yet comprehend. For Silas and the original investigators, the photos are a warning that humans are only guests on this ancient planet. They have decided to destroy the original coordinates of the metal door so that no more lives are lost in vain. The darkness inside the cliff will remain a mystery because the mountain has closed its door with thick layers of rock. This isolated church has a long history. The historic stone chapel, located on the high ridge of the northern valley, remained a silent witness to the local history. A heavy oak door stood in the darkest corner of the eastern transept to protect the original property deeds and maps. This facility was a critical link for the Parish Heritage Board because it provided the only physical evidence for the building. For 70 years, the archive operated without a single major incident until a Friday in November of 2022. On that day, the building recorded a sequence of structural shifts that defied every known engineering model used by the office. Lyle Vance was a 46-year-old historical preservation officer who worked for the regional government during that busy year. His primary job involved reviewing the weekly building reports to ensure the foundations remained stable against the shifting mountain groundwater. Lyle enjoyed the solitude of his work because it allowed him to explore the hidden corners of the town buildings. He was a man of meticulous detail who could spot a hairline fracture in 1,000 square feet of ancient stone. On that particular morning, he received a notification that a specific vibration sensor was experiencing a strange recurring calibration error. The descent took nearly 10 minutes as the air grew colder and the dim lights flickered over the damp walls. Lyle reached the end of the hall and connected his diagnostic tablet to the monitoring port located inside the metal box. He noticed that the data logs were almost full of movement alerts that should have been ignored by the software. The system was lagging because it was struggling to process a series of seismic readings taken during a recent light rain. Lyle decided to download the final batch of sensor data before he cleared the memory and reset the internal hardware. As the progress bar moved across his screen, he scrolled through the event logs to ensure the equipment was anchored. He saw the familiar baseline readings and the small spikes caused by the passing of heavy trucks on the road. One log from 3 nights prior caught his eye because the pressure signature looked different from the data around it. A massive weight had been applied to the internal side of the sealed wall just past the edge of the frame. The sensor recorded a steady push that lasted for exactly 5 minutes before the entire system went dark for a second. Lyle felt a slight chill because that section of the church was known for being a completely dead zone for signals. He clicked on the next file in the sequence to see if the building had shifted again during the night shift. The pressure was still there, but the sensor reading was now pulsing and a low-frequency hum stood near the frequency. The force appeared to be originating from deep beneath the floor, and it was pulling something heavy out from the dark. Lyle zoomed in on the digital waves until he could see the silhouette of a large and repeating vibration. He checked the timestamps and realized that the event had been at that specific location for less than 10 minutes total. The third log showed the pressure dropping back to zero and leaving nothing but a flat line in the file. Lyle looked toward the actual wall in the corner and saw that the mortar seal was still perfectly intact today. He felt a strange urge to investigate the area, even though his primary task for the day was already finished now. The air was stagnant, and the only sound was the hum of the ventilation fans echoing through the empty corridor. The floor was dry from the recent summer heat, and he noticed thin cracks in the stone where the wall met. He followed the line for about 5 feet until he reached a small gap hidden behind a stack of metal shelves. Lyle found a heavy iron latch tucked under a layer of thick dust and cobwebs that looked intentionally placed long ago. He reached down to touch the cold metal surface and saw that the heavy bolt was sealed with industrial wax. A faint smell of sulfur hung in the heavy air, and Lyle immediately pulled his hand back in sudden realization. He used his portable radio to contact the main office and reported that he had discovered a suspicious architectural anomaly today. Within an hour, 2 structural engineers arrived at the scene and began to secure the perimeter with bright orange plastic tape. They asked Lyle to show them the sensor logs on his tablet so they could identify the source of force. The engineers noted that the hidden hallway did not have a registered blueprint in any of the municipal archive books here. They carefully scraped the wax on the latch and discovered several rusted ventilation pipes from a forgotten early 20th century. The local museum had reported a missing set of original town founding documents 3 months earlier, but the police had nothing. These papers were extremely valuable, and a former clerk had likely hidden them in the wall until the investigation closed now. The engineers realized the thief must have used the old vault room to hide the stolen property behind the wall. They analyzed the sensor data from other units along the foundation to track the path of the subtle structural shifts. This lead eventually took them to a small residential house located 2 blocks over from the edge of the park. Inside the house, the authorities found more documents that had been taken during the same period earlier that same year. The suspect had been living there under a false name while he waited for a collector to finalize a secret sale. One of the men was a former janitor who knew exactly how to access the sub-basement without triggering alarms. He did not realize that the new vibration sensors were set to record every movement regardless of the weight or size. His simple mistake of leaning against the hidden latch had provided the only evidence needed to solve the case. Lyle returned to his office that afternoon and felt a sense of pride for paying attention to the small details today. Most people would have deleted the error logs without looking at the data because it was a routine maintenance job. The historical records were now safe from the thief, and the original deeds were returned to their rightful display cases. He continued his work across the municipal buildings and always looked a little closer at the logs from the basements. Sometimes the most important things are hidden in the background of a world that is always moving too fast. The hidden latch still stands in its dark corner and records the passage of time 1 minute at a time now. It sits behind the metal shelves and the occasional staff member who travels through the silence of the lower levels. No one ever suspects that a simple sensor could be the most important witness to a crime in the building. Lyle knows that every data log tells a story if someone is willing to take the time to look today. He walks the halls with a new perspective and watches the digital monitors for anything else the system catches. The federal investigation into the document theft revealed that the suspects had intended to sell the items on the market. This operation would have stripped the town of its legal history and compromised the property rights of many local families. The The recovery of the original land survey maps ensured that several ongoing legal disputes could be settled with accurate evidence. Lyle received a formal commendation from the mayor for his role in preserving the heritage of the entire valley community. He often shares the story of the hidden hallway with new preservation officers as a lesson in professional diligence. The quiet church stands on the hill and continues to serve the families as it has for many generations now. Visitors admire the architecture and the stained glass windows without knowing the secret that was hidden deep beneath the floor. The story of the vibration sensor and the iron latch has become a local legend among the town residents today. Most people walk past the oak door in the transept without realizing its significance in the history of the parish. For Lyle, the sound of the wind against the limestone will always be a reminder of the hidden truths. The truth about what happened on that Friday in October remains locked away in boxes of redacted paperwork and files. The people of the Quiet Valley continue their lives while the mystery of the church hallway hangs over the town. It is a reminder that some things are captured by the machines that are never meant to be understood by humans. Lyle continues to keep his watch from a distance, knowing that the sensors will eventually trigger another silent alarm today. The silence of the basement is never truly empty when the sensors are the only ones left to listen. The archives of the town recorded the passage of time as the seasons changed from the heat of the summer. The limestone walls of the old chapel remained strong against the wind that blew across the high ridge of the mountain. Lyle often looks at the digital feed from the sensors on his tablet while he sits in his quiet office. He knows that the history of the town is safe as long as someone is willing to watch the data. The record of the world continues to grow one frame at a time for anyone who cares to look. The structural engineers completed their final report on the hidden corridor and the forgotten vault room in the sub-basement. They found that the original construction had been modified several times during the early part of the 20th century. These changes were never added to the official maps of the town or the blueprints of the historic limestone chapel. This lack of information provided the perfect hiding place for someone who wanted to keep a secret in the dark. The discovery of the iron latch was a turning point in the investigation into the missing regional property deeds. The former janitor was arrested and charged with the theft of several state documents that were over 80 years old. He had been planning to move the items to a secondary location when the vibration sensor recorded his presence today. The evidence from the digital logs was a critical part of the case presented by the local district attorney. The community was relieved to know that the history of their homes and lands was once again secure in archives. Lyle continues to perform his duties with a sense of purpose that comes from knowing he made a difference. The story of the isolated church and its hidden history serves as a reminder of the value of the archives. It shows that even the most mundane data can hold the key to solving a mystery from the recent past. The machines that monitor our world are silent witnesses to the actions of the people who move through it. We may not always see the cameras or the sensors, but they are recording the truth 1 second at a time. For the residents of the valley, the stone chapel is more than just a place of quiet reflection now. The preservation of history requires the constant attention of people like Lyle Vance, who value the details of the world. He remains a dedicated officer who understands that the past is a foundation for the future of the quiet town. The record of the hidden hallway is a permanent part of the digital logs stored in the local government office. It will be there for the next generation of technicians to find when they perform their routine maintenance checks. The history of the church is written in the stone and preserved in the silent data of the sensors. In this new story, archived travel notes from cold region patrols mention a winter road exit where visitors reportedly vanished during heavy storms each January. The incidents share subtle similarities, which led locals to warn travelers about taking that route after dusk. No official conclusion ever linked the area to crime, which kept the road open despite unsettling reports. Clara Haldren, a 34-year-old wildlife survey assistant, drove that road during a mid-January evening as she returned from a remote tracking station. She planned to reach her lodge before nightfall since blizzard warnings suggested dangerous winds by midnight. Her assignment involved recording migration data, which required several hours in snowy terrain. By late afternoon, the sky turned darker than expected, which convinced her to take the faster exit toward the valley. The road narrowed as she approached the turnoff, where a leaning sign barely remained visible through swirling frost. Patches of wind-carved ice stretched across the asphalt, which forced her to slow her truck. She noticed tire marks moving toward the exit, despite local warnings posted on bulletin boards in nearby towns. She had heard stories about sudden whiteouts that formed without warning near the valley, but she never experienced one herself. Clara turned onto the exit, which dipped into a hollow between tall ridges. Snow absorbed nearly all sound, which gave the empty road an unnerving stillness. Her headlights caught glimpses of broken guardrails, which suggested others had struggled with the sharp curves. She breathed slowly while gripping the wheel because something about the air felt heavy. She checked the clock and noted she still had enough time to reach her lodge if the weather held. A faint flash reflected in her side mirror, which made her glance backward. For a moment, she thought she saw another vehicle, but nothing followed her. The hollow deepened until the ridges blocked the last hints of daylight. She continued carefully while her radio crackled with static. She tried adjusting the frequency, but the distortion grew louder until she shut it off to preserve concentration. As she neared the midpoint, she saw an overturned snowmobile lodged against a half-buried mile marker. She stopped her truck and stepped out into wind that bit through her jacket. The vehicle looked recently abandoned, which meant someone had been traveling this route despite community warnings. She called out anyone out here, but her voice faded quickly into the storm-filled air. She examined the snowmobile and found a torn glove caught near the ignition. Fresh footprints trailed away from the scene toward a gap in the ridge. The steps looked uneven, like the person stumbled repeatedly. Clara debated searching farther, but darkness pressed in fast, which made her decide to continue driving and report the discovery later. She returned to her truck, but before she could start the engine, a dull mechanical hum drifted across the hollow. The sound came from deeper along the road, which confused her because there were no structures nearby according to regional survey maps. She started the engine and followed the route slowly until she saw a faint orange light blinking in the distance. The light remained steady as she approached a wide bend where snow piled high along both shoulders. At the bend, she discovered an abandoned road maintenance trailer with its hazard beacon still running. The trailer door hung open while snow drifted inside. Her breath caught as she realized the beacon could not have lasted long in such cold conditions. She approached the trailer and saw scattered tools on the floor, including a cracked radio handset. A notebook lay half buried near the wheel, with entries mentioning repeated signal interference along the exit. As she flipped through the notebook, she found a page describing faint vibrations in the ground during certain storms. The writer mentioned hearing muffled clanks like large metal parts shifting beneath the road. Clara frowned because no underground structures existed in this region except old drainage channels long since collapsed. A sharp gust of wind slammed the trailer door, which made her jump. She returned to her truck and continued driving because the storm intensified rapidly. Snow fell so heavily it appeared as a wall of white ahead of her headlights. She slowed to a crawl and kept both hands tight on the wheel as she followed the faint curve of the asphalt. The ground trembled lightly beneath her, which reminded her of the notebook entry. She dismissed the idea because she believed the wind caused the shaking. A shadow crossed her headlights, which made her hit the brake. A lone figure stood near the shoulder, wearing a winter suit covered with frost. Clara rolled down her window slightly and called, "Do you need help?" But the figure remained motionless. She stepped out cautiously and walked toward them with her flashlight held steady. When she reached the figure, she saw the suit was empty. It hung on a crooked pole that had been planted in the snow. A small handwritten tag on the collar read, "Do not follow the lines." The message unsettled her because it sounded like a warning written in haste. She turned back toward her truck when the ground vibrated again. This time, the tremor felt rhythmic, like machinery running beneath frozen soil. She knelt and placed her hand on the snow, which gave a slight pulse. Her breath quickened as she looked around the hollow, now swallowed by dense, blowing snow. She hurried to her truck, but before she could enter, she heard a deep, metallic shift to the east. The sound carried through the wind like a massive gate sliding along rails. She could not see anything past the storm, but she sensed movement in the valley. She entered the truck and locked the doors while trying to think clearly. Her headlights flickered as if something interfered with the electrical lines. She tapped the dashboard, then noticed faint lights appearing ahead on the road. They flickered irregularly, like small beacons activating in sequence. The lights formed a line that guided toward a narrow pass between the ridges. Clara refused to approach that direction because locals frequently reported strange sightings near that pass. She reversed slowly while trying not to lose traction. The lights brightened briefly, then faded until darkness returned. The vibration beneath her truck continued for several minutes before stopping entirely. She took this brief calm to turn around on the narrow road, which required precise steering due to steep snowbanks. As she maneuvered her truck, the beam of her headlights crossed a collapsed service gate near the slope. She had not seen this gate earlier, which meant either snow covered it before or something triggered a shift that exposed it. She walked closer and found tracks leading inside a shallow service tunnel cut into the ridge. The tracks appeared similar to those from the abandoned snowmobile. She snapped several photos and backed away because the chemical scent of old fuel drifted from the opening. She returned to her truck, hoping to escape before the storm worsened. As she drove upward, the ground vibrated again, though softer this time. She kept her focus on the road until she reached the valley rim, where wind cleared some of the snow. From this angle, she saw faint glimmers below which matched the blinking beacons earlier. She paused briefly because the pattern formed straight lines that cut through the hollow in unnatural alignment. The moment she looked down, a loud clank echoed across the valley, which made her flinch. The beacons vanished instantly, as if someone shut them off in unison. She accelerated toward the main road while gripping the wheel tightly. The exit curved toward safer terrain until she reached an old ranger turnout. She parked beside the shelter and caught her breath. Inside the shelter, she found outdated emergency logs describing similar winter vibrations recorded years earlier. One entry mentioned a collapsed engineering project that attempted to construct a hidden supply tunnel during a past decade. The project was abandoned due to repeated cave-ins and unreported injuries. After reading more, she realized the collapsed network sat directly beneath the exit she had traveled. She left the shelter with a deeper understanding of the hollow. The underground structure might have partially remained intact, which explained the vibrations and moving air currents. Yet the functioning beacons and shifting patterns suggested someone continued to monitor or access the network despite its unstable condition. Clara reported everything to regional authorities after reaching her lodge. Investigators visited the exit days later when the storm cleared. They found the snowmobile missing along with the abandoned maintenance trailer. Only scattered tools remained frozen into the ice. The pole with the empty winter suit had fallen into a drift, and the tracks near the service tunnel had vanished under fresh snow. Survey teams detected slight subsurface cavities below the hollow, which matched remnants of old industrial tunnels. They also documented faint metallic debris buried deep under compacted snow, which suggested past attempts to reinforce underground sections. No modern machinery was found, which left the source of the vibrations unresolved. Locals continued to warn travelers about that exit each winter. They claimed the hollow changed during storms. Some believed shifting pressure reopened parts of the underground network. Others thought an unknown group used the tunnels secretly during harsh weather. Travelers who ignored warnings sometimes reported lights moving in patterns along the valley floor, though no proof ever surfaced. Clara kept her distance from the exit after that night. She felt certain someone maintained parts of the collapsed network. The beacons and rhythmic tremors convinced her the hollow remained active during storms. The winter road exit still cuts through that valley and remains open each January, despite repeated warnings whispered in nearby towns where people remember the old project and the long, silent tunnels that still breathe beneath the project. Snow. What happened in this roadside motel was never reported. Local police files from 1996 contain a series of strange reports about a motel on Highway 8. Most of these official documents were never released to the public because the findings were considered too strange for print. Lyle Thorne was a 42-year-old insurance investigator who specialized in finding high-value missing property. He spent most of his life driving through rural counties and staying in places that most people would usually avoid. One rainy Tuesday in October, he was looking for a place to rest after a long day of tedious work. The Sunnyside Inn sat on a quiet stretch of road that felt far away from any major town or city. Lyle pulled his sedan into the gravel lot and noticed that the neon sign was flickering in the dark woods. There were only two other cars parked in front of the long row of identical blue doors near the office. He checked into room 14 and paid the elderly man at the desk with $20 in crisp cash. The room smelled like old cedar and industrial cleaner, which was common for these types of cheap roadside lodging houses. Lyle set his briefcase on the desk and decided to record his daily notes before he went to sleep tonight. He turned on his portable tape recorder and started describing the mundane details of his latest insurance claim in the city. A sharp, metallic scratching sound coming from behind the wall made him stop talking in the middle of a sentence. He looked at the thin floral wallpaper and realized the sound was moving slowly from the ceiling toward the floor. Lyle walked over to the wall and pressed his ear against the cold surface to hear what was happening inside. He heard a soft, rhythmic thumping that sounded like a heavy heart beating against the wooden frame of the building. The investigator decided to walk outside to see if there was any maintenance work being done on the exterior wall. The gravel lot was completely empty, and the two cars he saw earlier were now gone without making any sound. He looked at the window of room 15 next door, but the heavy curtains were shut tight against the night. Lyle walked back into his room and noticed that his tape recorder was still running on the small wooden desk. He picked up the device and rewound the tape to see if the scratching sound had been caught on audio. When he pressed play, he did not hear his own voice or the scratching sounds from the thin motel walls. Instead, he heard a recording of a man and a woman having a very quiet conversation about a hidden basement. The voices on the tape sounded like they were standing right next to the microphone in the empty motel room. Lyle checked the recorder for any signs of tampering, but the device was exactly where he had left it earlier. He knew that his recorder had not been out of his sight since he entered the Sunnyside Inn that evening. The woman on the tape mentioned that the floorboards in room 14 were the only way to reach the stairs. Lyle looked down at the stained brown carpet and felt a chill go down his spine in the quiet room. He moved the heavy desk aside and peeled back a corner of the carpet to see what was underneath it. There was a small brass ring attached to a square piece of plywood that had been cut into the floor. He pulled the ring, and the wooden hatch opened with a loud groan that echoed through the small guest room. A narrow set of concrete stairs led down into a dark space that was not visible from the outside. Lyle grabbed his heavy flashlight from his briefcase and began to climb down into the hidden area beneath the motel. The air in the basement was cold and dry, which felt very different from the humid October air outside. He shone his light around the room and saw shelves filled with hundreds of small black boxes and white envelopes. Each box had a date and a room number written on the side in faded black ink from past years. Lyle reached for a box labeled 1984 and found a collection of personal items and Polaroid photos inside. There were driver licenses and wedding rings and small toys that looked like they belonged to families who stayed here. He realized that none of these items were mentioned in any of the local police reports he had ever read. He found a ledger on a nearby table that listed names of guests next to a column titled Final Status. Most of the entries in the ledger ended with the word processed, which made Lyle feel a deep sense of dread. He heard the sound of the blue door to room 14 opening directly above his head in the quiet motel. Lyle turned off his flashlight and crouched behind a stack of wooden crates to stay hidden in the thick darkness. He heard heavy footsteps walking across the floorboards and then the sound of the carpet being pulled back again. A bright beam of light shot down into the basement as the elderly manager peered into the dark square hole. The manager was holding a long iron bar, and he started to climb down the concrete stairs with slow movements. Lyle saw the man stop at the bottom of the stairs and look directly toward the crates where he was hiding. The manager whispered that he knew someone was down there because the ledger had been moved from its original spot. Lyle waited until the man turned his back, and then he bolted for the stairs with every ounce of energy. He scrambled up the concrete steps and pushed past the manager, who tried to grab his leg in the dark. Lyle reached the guest room and ran out the front door into the pouring rain without looking back at all. He jumped into his car and drove toward the nearest town until he found a gas station with bright lights. He called the county sheriff from a payphone and explained that he had found a hidden room at the motel. The sheriff arrived 30 minutes later and followed Lyle back to the Sunnyside Inn to investigate the strange hidden basement. When they arrived at the property, they found that the gravel lot was empty and the neon sign was dark. The office was locked and the manager was nowhere to be found when the sheriff knocked loudly on the door. They entered room 14 and pulled back the brown carpet, but they found nothing but solid subflooring and old nails. There was no brass ring and no wooden hatch and no sign that a hidden basement had ever existed there. The sheriff looked at Lyle with a look of deep suspicion and asked if he had been drinking that night. Lyle pulled the small black box from his jacket pocket to show the officer the evidence he had taken earlier. He opened the box, but instead of jewelry or photos, it was filled with nothing but gray dust and dirt. The sheriff told Lyle to go home and get some rest before he decided to file a false report charge. Lyle drove away, but he kept the tape recorder in the passenger seat as he headed toward the next city. He pressed play on the device to hear the mysterious voices one last time before he reached his own house. The tape was completely silent for several minutes until a new voice started speaking at a very low volume level. It was his own voice, but it was describing the basement and the ledger in the past tense, like history. The recording ended with the sound of a heavy wooden hatch closing and a brass ring hitting the floorboards softly. Lyle looked in his rearview mirror and saw a pair of headlights following him at a very long distance behind. He realized that the things he saw in the motel were never meant to be reported to the local authorities. The Sunnyside Inn was torn down 2 years later to make room for a new highway expansion through the county. Construction crews found nothing unusual in the soil, and no records of a basement were found in the city archives. Lyle Thorne moved to another state and stopped working as an insurance investigator shortly after that strange night in October. He never stayed in a roadside motel again for the rest of his life because he feared the walls. Some stories are better left in the dark where they cannot be proven or recorded by the light of day. The truth about Room 14 remains buried under miles of hot black asphalt and the silence of the deep woods. In this new story, archived winter investigation files from 3 different counties describe a particular stretch of mountain highway where whiteouts reportedly form faster than radio towers can update alerts. The phenomenon repeats every December. It isn't marked on public maps, authorities never officially classify it as hazardous, yet everyone living within 50 miles knows exactly which section it is. Locals simply call it the Ridge, travelers call it Cursed, and truckers who use the road at night learn quickly that you cannot outrun a whiteout there because the storms behave like something alive. Lennox Rourke, a 37-year-old contracted supply driver, drove that highway on a mid-December evening under a sky that looked too still for winter. The air felt heavy rather than cold, the kind of pressure that builds before storms gather but hides long enough to trick forecasters. He finished loading equipment crates onto the bed of his truck, tightened the straps twice, then checked his chains, flare kit, first aid bag, and the battery in his handheld radio. He kept a heavy thermos of coffee beside him, a habit formed after 20 winters spent hauling supplies into the mountains. He left the last outpost before dusk, following the 2-lane highway into a narrow canyon where wind usually howled through rock cuts. That night, the canyon remained silent. Not a single gust, not a single shifting branch. He watched his breath curl in the cab and felt the strange stillness press against the windows like a held breath. Snow lingered in small flurries that drifted in lazy spirals. The clouds above the ridge formed long, undisturbed sheets that glowed faintly in the fading light. 10 miles up, he noticed a pair of fresh tire tracks on the snow-coated pavement. They belonged to a smaller vehicle, likely a compact sedan judging by the width. The tracks wobbled toward the outer shoulder several times before correcting. Whoever drove ahead wasn't confident on the ice. Lennox radioed a routine position update, received static instead of a response, and slowed his speed as he approached a long curve that overlooked a steep ravine. Through his headlights, he saw the parked sedan. Its hazard lights blinked weakly. Snow piled against the bumper. The driver door hung open. He pulled behind it and stepped out into a sudden gust that didn't match the earlier calm. Snow stung his cheeks. The seat inside the sedan held a thin layer of frost, as if the driver abandoned it recently. A half-written note lay on the passenger floor. It described disorientation, a strange pulsing glare over the ridge, and worsening visibility ahead. The scrawled handwriting ended mid-sentence in a long, jagged mark. Footprints led into the dense timberline, then vanished abruptly where the wind swept through the trees. Lennox called out, but only swirling snow answered. He checked the trunk and glove compartment, confirming no luggage or wallet remained. It looked like the driver fled in a panic. He radioed dispatch again, but the signal cut in and out, the interference sharp and pulsing in sync with unseen static. He continued up the highway because the research lodge needed its supplies before temperatures dropped overnight. Snow deepened quickly. He flicked on the high beams and leaned forward as he climbed another 1,000 feet of elevation. The wind returned with sudden force, carrying sheets of white across the pavement. The whiteout formed instantly. In less than a second, his world turned to blinding white. His beams reflected back into his cab like a wall of light. The road disappeared beneath swirling frost. He slowed to a crawl, searching for the faint yellow line beneath the snow. The truck groaned as the wind shoved at its side. Then he felt it. A deep, rolling vibration beneath the pavement. It rumbled through the steering column and into his arms. At first, he thought he drove over cracked asphalt, but the vibration repeated in a pattern far too regular to be natural. It felt like machinery working under the road, pulsing in slow waves. A hollow hum filled the cab, not a noise from the engine, but something distant traveling through the ground. He gripped the wheel tighter and whispered to himself that he only needed to reach the next turnout. But the storm had erased every landmark. His radio crackled violently before going silent. Even emergency frequencies fell into total static. Through the swirling white, he saw a faint glow, dim and warm like a lantern or flare. It pulsed twice, then faded. The storm swallowed it whole. He finally spotted the turnout sign half buried under wind-shaped drifts. He turned into it and killed the engine. The moment the truck stilled, the world fell silent, except for the soft hiss of snow against the windows. The vibration beneath the ground returned, stronger this time. He stepped out and instantly felt the storm slam him sideways. Snow whipped across his vision in chaotic bursts. Still, he saw it again, the distant lantern-like glow flickering far down the ridge, swaying as if carried by an unsteady hand. He raised his flashlight and followed the glow. Each step sank past his ankles. The wind roared so loudly he barely heard his breathing. The lantern glow brightened, then dimmed. When he reached the ridge edge, the wind paused, just briefly, revealing a trail of fresh footprints descending into a narrow gap between two boulders. He followed the prints to a sheltered clearing, where the wind died completely. There, he found a metal service box half buried in ice. Its door hung open, clinking softly in the breeze. Inside, a flickering emergency lamp illuminated piles of old engineering logs scattered across the snow. He brushed frost off one page and read that decades ago, crews tried stabilizing the ridge after discovering deep fractures extending several miles beneath the highway. Some fractures reportedly produced heavy vibrations during cold snaps, others echoed with humming noises long after construction equipment shut down. One engineer wrote that whiteouts triggered surface shifts powerful enough to knock tools off tables. Another recorded flashes of color during storms that turned the snow blue for a moment before fading. None of the entries ended optimistically. The project halted after a series of unexplained injuries. The final pages contained abrupt, shaky handwriting as if recorded in haste before crews evacuated the area. The wind returned violently, slamming the service box door against its hinge. Snow blasted across the clearing, burying the footprints behind Lennox in seconds. He attempted to climb back to the turnout, but the storm collapsed around him. The whiteout erased all shape, all direction, all sense of slope. The vibration beneath the ground grew into a steady pulse. He dropped one knee into the drift, bracing himself. Then the light appeared again, this time brighter, bluish, and closer. It flashed once, then again. It illuminated the storm like lightning flickering inside a closed room. He shielded his face as the vibration stopped abruptly, leaving a deep ringing in his ears. When the storm eased momentarily, he recognized the outline of his truck barely 30 yards uphill. He pushed through the drifts and climbed into the cab with shaking hands. His headlights flickered, the dashboard lights dimmed, and then something struck the back of the truck. Not a rock, not debris, something heavy enough to shift the entire chassis. He looked through the rear window but saw only churning white. When the dash lights returned, he noticed new tracks behind his vehicle footprints moving in a staggering, uneven pattern. They circled the back of the truck twice before stopping abruptly at an untouched drift. No exit trail. No continuation. Just sudden absence. The radio crackled violently. A voice broke through for half a second, a woman screaming a word he couldn't understand. The signal collapsed again before the dispatcher came through, faintly asking for his status. Lennox forced his voice steady as he reported everything he'd seen. She ordered him to return immediately. The descent felt endless. Whiteout pockets still erupted at random, swallowing the world in sudden blindness before releasing it again. Snow reflected his taillights in ghostly red bursts. The mountain behind him pulsed with silent flashes he could not explain. Only when he reached the lower forest line did the storm finally weaken. Search teams reached the abandoned sedan the next morning. The seat still held a thin layer of frost. The driver never returned. No prints remained except deep indentations captured in early photographs. A team located the service box clearing and retrieved the logs, confirming chronic seismic anomalies beneath that stretch of highway. Several log entries matched the timing of Lennox's report almost exactly. But the most disturbing discovery came from the audio files engineers recovered from Lennox's malfunctioning radio. Buried beneath the static, analysts detected irregular pulses matching the tremor pattern of underground shifts too deep and too rhythmic to be caused by ordinary geological movement. Locals still warn travelers never to trust the ridge's calm skies. They say the whiteouts there do not behave like normal storms. They arrive instantly. They vanish instantly. And sometimes, during the brightest flashes, they reveal silhouettes of things standing where no person could stand. Some claim to hear humming beneath the tires just before the visibility collapses. Others swear the snow glows blue right before the tremors begin. Lennox refuses to drive that highway now. He told investigators he can still feel the vibration in his bones when he thinks about the storm. And he still dreams about the footprints appearing behind his truck, circling twice before ending nowhere, as if something walked there only long enough to watch him through the snow. He knows one thing for certain. On that mountain highway, you cannot outrun a whiteout. Not because it moves fast, but because it feels like the storm is already waiting for you the moment you decide to climb the ridge. And once the wind closes, there is no direction, only white, only echoes, and only the sense that something beneath the road finally woke up. The missing tape, found inside an abandoned ranger station. In the late summer of 1984, a local hiking group discovered a small cabin hidden deep within the woods. The structure served as an old ranger station that the forestry department had officially decommissioned over 30 years before that day. Inside the dusty main room, they found a single magnetic tape sitting on a desk next to an empty lantern. The reel was thick with grime and appeared to have been untouched since the mid-20th century was still in its prime. Silas Vance was a 32-year-old land surveyor who spent most of his weeks mapping the rugged terrain. He arrived at the trailhead early on a Tuesday morning with the simple goal of marking the western boundary lines. The weather was unusually clear for that time of year, and Silas expected to finish his work before the sunset. He carried a heavy pack filled with surveying tools and a large thermos of coffee to keep his energy levels high. The forest was quiet, and the air felt heavy with the scent of damp pine needles and ancient decaying wood. As Silas pushed through a dense thicket of pine trees, he stumbled upon the rotted remains of a wooden fence. He followed the timberline until he saw the silhouette of a small building perched on a rocky limestone ledge. The windows were boarded up with gray planks, and the front door hung slightly open on its rusted iron hinges. Silas stepped onto the porch and felt the floorboards groan under his weight as he moved toward the dark interior. He noticed that the structural integrity of the cabin was failing as the roof sagged under the weight of moss. He pushed the door open and noticed a strange scent of old paper and copper hanging heavy in the air. A thick layer of dust covered every surface, but the desk in the center of the room looked surprisingly clean. Silas approached the desk and saw a reel-to-reel tape recorder sitting ready as if someone just stepped away. He found a small black cassette tape resting beside the machine with a handwritten label that simply said August 4th. The handwriting was cramped and looked as though it had been written by a hand that was shaking with fear. According to local archives, the last ranger assigned to this specific station was a man named Elias Thorne in 1950. Dispatch logs from that year indicate that Elias stopped responding to his weekly radio check-ins without any prior warning. Search teams combed the surrounding hills for several weeks but never found a trace of the missing Forest Service employee. Silas picked up the tape and realized it was the only piece of modern equipment left in the entire building. He felt a cold sensation in his chest as he wondered what had truly happened to the man named Elias. The surveyor decided to bring the tape back to his office to see if the recorded audio contained any clues. He spent the next 3 hours hiking back to his truck while the sun began to dip below the horizon. Silas felt a strange sense of urgency to hear the voice of the man who had vanished so long ago. He drove home in silence and immediately began searching for a compatible player to listen to the old magnetic reel. The town was quiet as he passed through the main street and noticed the flickering lights of the old theater. Silas eventually found a working player at a local thrift store and connected it to his desk speakers that evening. He pressed the play button and heard a soft hiss of static, followed by the sound of a heavy door closing. A voice that sounded tired and strained began to speak about a series of lights appearing in the northern valley. The man on the recording claimed that the lights were moving in patterns that did not match any known aircraft. He spoke with a level of detail that suggested he was an experienced observer of the natural mountain world. The narrator described how the lights would hover over the tree line for hours before disappearing into the deep mountain lakes. Witness statements from 1950 mentioned similar sightings by residents in the nearby town of Oakhaven during that same summer. Elias Thorne reported that he had started hearing a low humming sound coming from the floorboards of the station. He believed that something was living beneath the cabin and was using the radio antenna to broadcast a strange signal. The humming was reportedly so intense that it caused the glass jars on the shelves to vibrate and crack. Silas listened closely as the recording captured the sound of rhythmic tapping against the exterior walls of the ranger station. Elias stopped speaking for several seconds, and the only sound on the tape was the heavy breathing of a man. The ranger whispered that he could see eyes reflecting the moonlight through the gaps in the wooden boards of the door. He claimed that the visitors were not from the town, and they did not look like any animals he knew. The tapping was persistent and moved from the walls up to the shingles on the roof with great speed. The investigation into the disappearance of Elias Thorne had originally concluded that he likely suffered from isolation and wandered off. However, the details on the tape suggested that the ranger was documenting a very specific and physical threat to his safety. Silas paused the audio and looked at the date on the tape, which was the day before Elias went missing. He felt a chill run down his spine as he realized the tapping on the recording was getting much louder. The sound was sharp and sounded like metal striking against the ancient wood of the isolated mountain station. The final few minutes of the audio contained a frantic description of the cabin being surrounded by a bright blue light. Elias shouted that the humming sound was vibrating the glass in the windows and making his ears bleed from the pressure. He mentioned that he was going to hide the tape in the desk and hoped that someone would eventually find it. The recording ended abruptly with a loud metallic crash and the sound of the wind rushing through the open station. Silence filled the room of Silas as the tape continued to spin without any more recorded sound or voices. Silas contacted the local historical society the next morning to share the evidence he had recovered from the abandoned woods. A researcher named Marcus Reed examined the tape and confirmed that the voice matched the old radio logs of Elias Thorne. They returned to the site of the ranger station together to look for the hidden compartment Elias mentioned on the tape. The forest seemed different under the morning light, but the feeling of being watched remained heavy on their minds. They found a small metal box buried under the floorboards that contained a series of photographs and a silver ring. The photographs showed blurry images of metallic objects hovering over the very trees Silas had walked through just the day before. One image captured a tall figure standing in the shadows of the porch with elongated limbs and very large dark eyes. Marcus noted that the silver ring had strange symbols etched into the band that did not belong to any language. They realized that Elias Thorne had not simply disappeared, but had been documenting an encounter that defies any logical explanation. The symbols on the ring seemed to glow faintly when the men brought it into the direct sunlight. The authorities reopened the case, but the physical evidence remained the only proof of what happened on that August night. Silas often thinks about the quiet ranger station and the man who spent his final hours recording a warning for others. The tape serves as a haunting reminder that some mysteries are buried in the woods for a very good reason. He no longer surveys that section of the forest because the low humming sound still echoes in his quiet dreams. The station remains empty and forgotten by most, but the tape still holds the secrets of 1950. Every time Silas looks at the jagged peaks of the mountains, he remembers the frantic voice of the lost forest ranger. He kept a copy of the tape in a safe place, but he rarely has the courage to play the audio. The researcher Marcus Reed moved away shortly after the investigation ended, and he never spoke of the silver ring again. Local legends continue to grow about the station on the limestone ledge and the lights that still appear in the valley. Silas knows that the truth is recorded on that thin magnetic strip hidden inside the drawer of his wooden desk. An archived voicemail investigators still study. The silent servers of the regional telecommunications hub in the coastal city of Blackwood Bay remained a quiet witness to the digital age. A single automated backup drive sat perched atop a weathered metal rack inside the remote boundary of a busy industrial park. This specific device was programmed to record all redirected emergency voicemails every 60 seconds to monitor service reliability and potential network failures. Local communications officials rarely checked the digital archives unless a significant outage or a major system crash was reported in the area. On a Tuesday, in October of 2022, the recorder captured a sequence of audio data that seemed entirely ordinary. Silas Thorne was a 44-year-old senior systems technician who worked for the regional utility department during that busy year. His primary job involved traveling to remote locations to ensure that backup power units and data transmitters were functioning within normal parameters. Silas enjoyed the solitude of his work because it allowed him to explore the rugged landscape far from the crowded city noise. He was a man of meticulous detail who could spot a signal interference pattern in 1,000 lines of raw code. On that particular morning, he received a notification that a specific server unit was experiencing a strange recurring storage error. He packed his tools into his white utility truck and began the long drive toward the isolated signal tower near the coast. The drive took nearly 3 hours, and the fog hung low over the dense canopy of ancient cedar and fir trees. Silas reached the base of the tower and connected his rugged laptop to the diagnostic port located inside the metal box. He noticed that the hard drive was almost full of temporary files that should have been deleted automatically every 30 days. The system was lagging because it was struggling to process a series of voice recordings taken during a recent heavy rainstorm. Silas decided to download the final batch of audio files before he cleared the memory and reset the internal software of the server. He wanted to make sure the digital sensor had not been damaged by the high humidity or the coastal salt air. As the progress bar moved across his screen, he scrolled through the audio waves to ensure the recordings were still properly indexed. He saw the familiar blue lines and the blurred shapes of passing data packets that moved through the system at high speeds. One recording from 3 nights prior caught his ear because the background static sounded different from the audio files around it. A single voicemail was placed from a narrow shoulder of the highway just past the edge of the rocky cliffs. The caller had their voice low, and the message was left standing wide open toward the dark and crashing ocean waves. It was an odd place to call because that specific section of the road was known for having absolutely no cellular service. Silas felt a slight chill because the caller reportedly sounded calm despite the absolute silence of the surrounding environment during the midnight hours. He clicked on the next file in the sequence to see if the person was speaking to a dispatcher for emergency help. The audio log was still there, but the verbal report was now silenced and a dark hum stood near the end. The signal appeared to be reaching into the dense brush, and it was pulling something heavy out from the digital shadows. Silas zoomed in on the grainy audio until he could see the silhouette of a large and repeating electronic pulse. The data on his screen was describing a rhythmic movement that matched the pace of a slow and steady physical breath. He checked the timestamps and realized that the call had been at that specific location for less than 5 minutes total. The third recording showed the signal strength pulling back to zero and leaving nothing but tire tracks in the audio file. Silas looked toward the actual spot on the map and saw that the ground was entirely undeveloped near the pine trees. He felt a strange urge to investigate the area, even though his primary task for the day was already finished. He stepped into his truck and drove toward the exact place where the signal had pointed in the archived radio log. The air was cold, and the only sound was the wind whistling through the high branches of the trees. The ground was soft from the recent rains, and he noticed deep gouges in the earth where something heavy had been dragged. He followed the trail for about 50 feet until he reached a small clearing hidden behind a thicket of overgrown ferns. Silas found a heavy metal storage trunk tucked under a pile of damp pine needles and branches that looked intentionally placed. He reached down to touch the cold plastic surface and saw that the heavy latches were sealed with industrial duct tape. A faint smell of metallic decay hung in the stagnant air, and Silas immediately pulled his hand back in sudden realization. He knew that he should not open the container without the proper law enforcement authorities present at the remote scene. He used his mobile radio to contact the dispatch office and reported that he had discovered a suspicious item in the woods. Within an hour, 2 state troopers arrived at the scene and began to secure the perimeter with yellow plastic tape. They asked Silas to show them the audio logs on his laptop so they could identify the tone and the pitch. The officers noted that the caller did not have a registered phone number in any of the captured maritime records. They carefully cut the tape on the trunk and discovered several stolen historical artifacts from a local museum storage facility. These were items that had been missing for months following a quiet break-in that left no physical evidence behind. The museum had reported a quiet break-in 3 months earlier, but the investigators had no leads on the missing items. These artifacts were extremely valuable, and the thieves had likely hidden them in the forest until the search died down. The police realized the caller must have returned to the woods to move the cache to a more permanent location. They analyzed the signal logs from other towers along the coast to track the path of the unknown vehicle. This lead eventually took them to a small rental property located 2 towns over from the edge of the park. They found the suspect living in a detached garage behind a row of tall hedges and old weeds. Inside the house, the authorities found more items that had been taken during the same period earlier that same year. The suspect had been living there under a false name while he waited for a buyer to finalize a secret purchase. One of the men was a former security guard who knew exactly how to avoid the primary surveillance monitoring systems. He did not realize that the remote signal tower was set to record every frequency, regardless of any active transmission. His simple mistake of making a call in that specific spot had provided the only evidence needed to solve the case. The archives of the utility department had captured the one moment he thought was completely private in the dark. Silas returned to his office that afternoon and felt a sense of pride for paying attention to the small details. Most people would have deleted the corrupted files without listening to the audio because it was a routine maintenance job. The historical records were now safe from the looters, and the original artifacts were returned to their rightful display cases. He continued his work across the mountains and always looked a little closer at the logs from the lonely signal towers. Sometimes the most important things are hidden in the background noise of a world that is always moving too fast. The quiet technician had become an accidental hero by simply doing his job with a very watchful ear. The automated recorder still sits in its metal box and records the passage of time, one file at a time. It captures the wind and the trees and the occasional signal that travels through the silence of the deep woods. No one ever suspects that a simple machine could be the most important witness to a crime in the wilderness. Silas knows that every audio log tells a story if someone is willing to take the time to listen. He drives the coast with a new perspective and watches the signal meters for anything else the antenna might catch. The forest remains vast and mysterious, but it is no longer a place where secrets can stay hidden forever. The federal investigation revealed that the suspects had intended to sell the items on the black market to private collectors. This operation would have stripped the town of its legal history and compromised the integrity of the local museum archives. The recovery of the original artifacts ensured that several ongoing historical research projects could be settled with accurate evidence. Silas received a formal commendation from the regional board for his role in preserving the heritage of the entire coastal community. He often shares the story of the archived voicemail with new technicians as a lesson in professional diligence and care. The signal logs are now fully digitized, but the physical history remains protected by the sensors and the heavy forest. The quiet tower stands on the hill and continues to serve the residents as it has for many years. Visitors drive past the industrial park without knowing the secret that was hidden deep beneath the canopy of the trees. The story of the digital recorder and the metal trunk has become a local legend among the city residents. Most people walk past the signal tower without realizing its significance in the history of the regional maritime safety. For Silas, the sound of the wind against the antenna will always be a reminder of the hidden truths. The record of the world continues to grow one frame at a time. For anyone who cares to look, the truth about what happened on that Tuesday in October remains locked away in boxes of redacted paperwork and files. The people of Blackwood Bay continue their lives while the mystery of the archived voicemail hangs over the coast. It is a reminder that some things are captured by the machines that are never meant to be understood by humans. Silas continues to keep his watch from a distance, knowing that the sensors will eventually trigger another silent alarm. The silence of the forest is never truly empty when the sensors are the only ones left to listen. The story of the call is written in the data and preserved in the digital logs. This security footage was reviewed years later. The grainy black and white pixels of an old security tape often hide more secrets than they reveal to the naked eye. Digital archives from the mid-1990s show that most regional storage facilities only kept footage for 30 days before recording over it. Silas Vance was 62 years old and worked as a consultant for a private archival firm specializing in cold cases. He had spent his entire career looking for the small details that other investigators missed during the initial chaos of a crime. Silas arrived at the climate-controlled warehouse in the autumn of 2024 to review a box of labeled tapes. His goal for the week was to digitize the final records of a defunct shipping company located in a remote valley. The air inside the vault was dry and smelled of old magnetic tape and the faint scent of ozone from the machines. The first strange clip appeared on a tape labeled 17 January 1988 at precisely 2 o'clock in the morning. It showed the perimeter fence of a loading dock during the height of a historic blizzard that had paralyzed the entire region. Silas watched as a man in a thick jacket walked slowly past the camera while carrying a long metallic surveyor rod. The man did not look at the lens, but he moved with a strange mechanical rhythm that seemed to ignore the wind. Silas paused the frame and tried to sharpen the image, but the snow was too thick to see a face clearly. He logged the timestamp and moved to the next reel, which covered a different camera angle on the opposite side. An hour of footage went by before the man appeared again on a camera located 3 miles away at a substation. This witness footage was captured only 10 minutes after the first sighting, which made the distance traveled physically impossible for anyone. Silas checked the map of the facility and realized the terrain between the two cameras was a steep and icy ravine. It would take a team of professional climbers hours to traverse that gap, even in the best possible summer weather conditions. The figure in the red jacket stood perfectly still in front of the high-voltage transformers for exactly 60 seconds total. He appeared to be taking measurements of the air itself, while the transformers sparked and glowed with a strange blue light. The investigator began to feel a sense of heavy dread as he realized the figure was not a standard trespasser or thief. He decided to cross-reference the footage with the dispatch logs he had discovered in a separate file from that era. Silas found a report from a dispatcher named Vance, who had noted a similar pattern of sightings during that same storm. The logs mentioned a man in a red jacket appearing at various points along the regional power grid in a straight line. Silas felt a chill as he realized the footage he was watching provided the visual evidence for these legendary ghost calls. He reached for a notepad and began to map out the coordinates of every camera that had captured the strange figure. A third clip showed the man standing on the roof of the main warehouse, looking out toward the dark mountain range. The camera was mounted 20 feet high, and there was no ladder or staircase that led to that specific vantage point. The figure held the surveyor rod high above his head as if he were trying to catch a signal from the sky. A massive flash of lightning illuminated the entire frame for a fraction of a second, and the man simply vanished into air. When the light faded, the roof was empty, and the only thing moving was the snow blowing across the flat surface. Silas replayed the segment 10 times, but he could not find any evidence of a jump or a hidden door. Silas started comparing the visual data with the original surveyor blueprints for the valley that were drawn in 1972. He used a digital overlay to match the positions of the man with the planned locations for the utility tower foundations. The points on the video matched the blueprints with a margin of error of less than 1 single inch of space. This line did not follow the actual towers that were built, but followed the original path that was later abandoned. Silas felt his hands shake as he realized the figure was following a ghost map of a project that never existed. He realized the man was Elias, who was the surveyor who had disappeared during the Great Blizzard of 1972. He reached out to a contact at the State University who specialized in electromagnetic anomalies and the recording of historical events. The professor listened to the description of the blue sparks and the surveyor rod, and he stayed silent for a long time. The academic finally suggested that the heavy snow and the high voltage lines might have created a natural recording of the past. He explained that certain materials can act as a permanent storage medium for human energy under the right atmospheric pressure conditions. Silas looked back at the screen and saw the man in the red jacket tapping on a window in the background. The tapping was silent on the tape, but Silas could almost hear the rhythmic sound echoing through the empty warehouse vault. The final reel of the collection showed the interior of the dispatch office during the transition of the morning shift change. Silas saw a younger version of himself sitting at the console while staring intensely at a paper map on the desk. In the reflection of the glass window behind the young Silas, he could see the man in the red jacket standing. The figure was not inside the room, but appeared to be standing in the reflection as if he were watching. Silas froze in the frame and realized the surveyor was looking directly at the map and pointing to the final substation. This footage had never been reviewed by anyone because the shipping company had gone bankrupt shortly after the storm of '88. Silas realized the figure was not a ghost in the traditional sense, but was a loop of time caught in wire. He received a final notification from the digitization software that the last tape had been successfully processed and stored in cloud. A technician near the end of the warehouse reported a strange humming sound coming from the old tape player in the corner. She said the machine was unplugged, but the reels were spinning at a high rate of speed while emitting blue light. Silas told her to leave the room immediately, and he locked the door to the vault with a heavy iron key. He looked at the monitors one last time and saw the red jacket standing in the middle of the warehouse aisle. The archival firm finished the project, but they decided to redact the specific timestamps of the man in the red jacket. They found a vintage surveyor rod hidden behind a false wall in the basement during the final sweep of the building. There was no explanation for how it got there or why the metal felt warm to the touch in winter. Silas kept a single screenshot of the reflection in his wallet as a reminder of the man who stayed behind. He never returned to the valley, and he stopped working as a cold case consultant shortly after the project ended. The tapes were destroyed in a controlled fire to prevent the loop from spreading to other modern digital recording systems. The mystery of the 1972 surveyor remains an unsolved file in the dusty cabinets of the local sheriff office. Experts say that the footage was likely a double exposure caused by the age of the magnetic tape and the heat. Silas knew the difference between a technical error and a man trying to find his way back to the main road. He lived the rest of his life in a house with no mirrors and no windows that faced the north side. The memory of the red pixels remained as a factual record of a night when the past became the present. The blizzard eventually ends, but the patterns we leave behind in the static never truly fade away from the world. This abandoned cabin drew quiet warnings. The dense forests of the northern border states are filled with small structures that have been reclaimed by the thick moss over time. Local history records from the early 1970s indicate that one specific property on the ridge was deliberately left off all official maps. Silas Vance was 58 years old and worked as a senior land surveyor for a private timber company in the valley. He had spent 30 years walking through the brush, but he always avoided the steep slope near the jagged limestone cliffs. Silas arrived at the base of the ridge during a rainy morning in October with a goal to mark the timberline. The air was heavy with the scent of damp pine needles and the distant sound of the rushing mountain river below. He pushed through a thick stand of cedar trees and found the cabin standing in a small and unnervingly quiet clearing. The first strange detail was that the cabin appeared to be built from timber that did not grow in this specific region. Silas saw that the logs were a dark and heavy species of wood that usually only exists in much higher altitudes. He checked his handheld GPS unit and found that the signal was bouncing wildly between different coordinates in a fast pattern. Silas moved toward the front door and noticed that the wood had been carved with hundreds of small and precise notches. The local sheriff had once told Silas that the old cabin was a place where people went when they wanted to vanish. This warning had seemed like a simple campfire story until Silas saw the heavy iron locks on the outside of the door. Silas assumed the locks were meant to keep animals out, but they were positioned to keep something from pushing the door open. An hour later, Silas found a rusted metal box buried under a pile of rotted firewood near the back porch steps. This box contained a stack of black and white photographs and a small diary wrapped in a piece of red fabric. The photos were dated from 1964 to 1972, and they showed the cabin at different times of day. Silas flipped through the images and realized that the forest around the cabin never changed or grew in the 8 years shown. It looked like the trees were frozen in a specific stage of autumn despite the passage of nearly a decade of seasons. Silas checked the names written on the back of the photos, but they were all listed as missing in the county. It was impossible to tell why these people had gathered at this cabin, or what they were waiting for in the woods. The surveyor began to feel a sense of heavy observation as he stood in the center of the silent forest clearing. He decided to open the diary to see if it contained any explanation for the strange notches on the exterior logs. Silas read the entries and found that the writer was a man who claimed the cabin was not always physically there. The man wrote that the structure would appear during the heavy fog and then vanish when the sun hit the high ridge. Silas felt a chill despite his heavy wool coat because the handwriting looked exactly like the notes from the old dispatcher files. His mentor had mentioned a surveyor named Elias, who disappeared on this ridge during a storm in 1972. Elias had been tasked with marking the same timberline that Silas was currently standing on during this rainy autumn. A third anomaly appeared when Silas looked through the dusty window and saw a table set for a very large meal. The plates were filled with food that looked fresh and steaming, even though the cabin had been abandoned for many years. Silas placed his hand on the glass and found that the window was vibrating with a low and steady electrical hum. One specific chair at the head of the table was pulled out as if someone had just stood up to leave. This chair faced a wall that was covered in a massive map of the stars that were not currently visible. Silas asked himself why a simple woodsman would need such a complex understanding of the movement of the celestial bodies. When Silas looked back at the forest, he saw a man in a red jacket standing near the cedar trees. Silas started connecting the dates in the diary with the records of the great blizzard that hit the valley years ago. He used a red pen to mark the nights when the local residents had reported seeing strange lights on the ridge. The lights occurred on the exact same nights that the missing persons had last been seen by their family and friends. This pattern suggested that the cabin was acting as a beacon or a doorway for something that moved in the dark. Silas felt the ground shake under his heavy boots, even though there were no active fault lines in this mountain range. He realized the cabin was not a shelter, but was a fixed point for a signal that was being broadcast. Silas reached out to a retired park ranger who had patrolled this sector back in the late 1960s. The ranger listened to the description of the red fabric, and he told Silas to leave the ridge immediately without looking back. The old man whispered that the cabin was built on a pocket of air that did not belong to this world. He claimed that the notches on the logs were a countdown that had been running for over 50 years of time. Silas looked back at the diary and realized the numbers were counting down to the exact date of the current afternoon. Every name listed in the county archives was actually a witness who had seen the cabin appearing through the thick gray fog. Silas found a page that described a man who would come to finish the survey and take the final measurements. The surveyor Elias was the last person to sign the diary before the entries stopped in the winter of '72. According to the final note, Elias had discovered that the cabin was the source of the magnetic interference in the area. Silas realized the man in the red jacket was not a ghost, but was a projection of the lost surveyor himself. He received one final shock when he looked at his own compass and saw the needle spinning in a perfect circle. The figure in the red jacket began to walk toward the cabin door with a steady and very mechanical rhythm. Silas turned away and ran back toward the river as the fog began to swallow the entire ridge in white. He realized that the ordinary cabin was a trap for anyone who tried to map the secrets of the mountain. Silas packed his gear and decided to report that the ridge was too unstable for any timber harvesting or commercial activity. He called his supervisor to say that the coordinates were blocked by limestone deposits that interfered with the radio signal. The supervisor accepted the report without any further questions, as if he were relieved to finally close the folder forever. Silas drove away and watched the mountain peak disappear in the clouds as the first heavy rain began to fall. He kept the red fabric in his pocket as a reminder of the man who was still marking the lines. He never spoke about the cabin to the other surveyors or to the people who lived in the valley. The property was officially designated as a protected wilderness area, but the logs remain there in the deep and quiet. The mystery of the abandoned cabin remains a secret known only to those who have felt the vibration in the ground. Experts say that the mountain air can cause a person to lose their sense of direction and see strange things. Silas knew the difference between a natural fog and a structure that existed between the ticks of a mechanical clock. He lived the rest of his life watching the weather reports for any mention of the ridge and the fog. The forest holds its secrets in the deep roots, and the wind covers the sound of the tapping on wood. The quiet warnings were real, and the cabin is still waiting for the next person to find the path. Silas Vance died, knowing that some lines on a map are not meant to be crossed by any living man. The timber company eventually sold the rights to the land to a private conservation group that promised to keep it wild. They had seen the reports filed by Silas and decided that some areas were better left untouched by modern development. The cabin remains hidden by the fast-growing brush and the thick blankets of snow that fall every single winter. Hikers occasionally report a faint hum coming from the ridge, but they are usually warned to stay on the main trails. The local historical society keeps a small file on the surveyor Elias, but it is restricted to high-level researchers. Silas had left a map behind that showed exactly where the cabin was, but he had crossed it out. He knew that documenting the location was a danger to anyone who might feel tempted to solve the mystery. The air on the ridge stays colder than the surrounding forest, even during the peak of the summer heat in July. Animals avoid the clearing, and birds do not build nests in the branches of the cedar trees that surround the cabin. The surveyor rod that Silas found was never officially turned in to the authorities because he feared what they would do. He buried it in his own backyard under a foot of concrete where it could no longer send out a signal. The red jacket continues to be seen by those who are lost in the woods during the heavy autumn rains. They say the man helps them find their way back to the river before the fog takes the cabin away. It is a cycle that has no beginning and no end in the long history of the mountains. The records of the missing persons were never updated because no remains were ever found on the ridge or nearby. The families eventually moved away, but they always left a light on in case their loved ones finally came home. Silas had realized that the cabin was a place of waiting where time did not function like a straight line. He understood that the people in the photos were still sitting at that table in a different version of today. The stars on the wall map were a guide for a journey that was not meant to be taken on foot. The notches on the logs will eventually reach zero, and the cabin will become a permanent part of the ridge. Silas Vance died at the age of 84 with a smile on his face and a compass in his hand. The woods are deep and full of things that we were never meant to understand with our limited human logic. The warnings were quiet because the truth was too loud for the residents of the small valley to hear clearly. Every time a surveyor goes out to mark a new line, they feel the eyes of the mountain on them. They know that the past is always just a few steps behind them in the thick fog of the forest. The story of Silas and Elias is told in whispers during the long nights of the northern winter storms. It is a reminder that the world is much larger and stranger than any map could ever hope to show. The abandoned cabin stands in silence while the wind carries the sound of a surveyor marking the wooden logs. Why this mountain road is closed every winter. The high elevation passes of the northern Sierra Range are subject to weather conditions that can bury a heavy semi-truck in minutes. Local highway department records indicate that one specific stretch of blacktop near the granite peaks has remained gated since 1988. Silas Vance was 56 years old and worked as a lead safety inspector for the Regional Department of Transportation Division. He had spent 30 years evaluating road stability, but he always felt a strange pressure in his ears near the summit. Silas arrived at the lower gate during a gray morning in November with a simple goal to check the seasonal locks. The air was thin and carried the scent of frozen stone and the metallic tang of an approaching heavy snowstorm. He drove his four-wheel drive pickup toward the restricted zone and noticed the pavement was covered in thin black ice. The first strange detail was that the road surface appeared to be steaming despite the temperature being well below the freezing point. Silas saw that the heat was coming from the center line and it was melting the ice in a perfect path. He checked the thermal sensors on his dashboard and found that the asphalt was radiating nearly 90 degrees of localized heat. Silas stopped the truck and walked to the edge of the guardrail to see if there were any underground steam pipes. The maintenance logs showed no geothermal activity in this sector, and no utility lines had been buried beneath the remote mountain road. Silas looked down the steep embankment and saw that the snow was completely gone from a circular patch of rocky earth. He assumed it was a chemical reaction from the road salt, but the smell in the air was sweet and floral. An hour later, Silas found a set of heavy equipment tracks that led away from the road and into the trees. These tracks did not match any of the department plows or the standard tread of a modern commercial or civilian vehicle. Silas followed the markings for 50 yards and found a vintage surveyor rod standing upright in the middle of the brush. The metal was polished and looked brand new despite the harsh mountain environment that usually rusted iron in a single season. Silas checked the serial number on the rod and realized it belonged to a crew that vanished in 1972. That specific team had been tasked with mapping the original route before the road was paved for the local logging industry. It was impossible for the tool to be in such perfect condition after sitting in the forest for several decades. The inspector began to feel a sense of heavy static as he held the cold metal rod in his gloved hands. He decided to return to his truck and check the archived radio logs from the year the surveyor crew went missing. Silas heard a recording of a man named Elias who was calling for a location check during a sudden whiteout storm. Elias reported that the road was turning beneath his feet and that the mountain was moving like a massive living thing. Silas felt a chill when he realized the voice on the old tape sounded remarkably clear and lacked any background wind. He looked at the rod again and noticed that it was vibrating with a low frequency that made his teeth ache. The inspector realized the road was not closed because of the snow, but because of a physical displacement of space. A third anomaly appeared when Silas looked through his binoculars and saw a man in a red jacket standing on the peak. The figure was holding a transit level and appeared to be taking measurements of the clouds that were rolling over the ridge. Silas called out to the man, but the wind swallowed his voice and the figure did not turn or acknowledge him. The man moved with a rhythmic and mechanical grace that suggested he was following a very specific set of internal instructions. Silas checked the local missing person files and found a photo of Elias wearing that exact same bright red parka jacket. When Silas looked through the lenses a second time, the peak was empty and only the gray rocks remained in view. He realized the surveyor was still finishing the job he started 50 years ago during the Great Winter Blizzard. Silas started connecting the dates of the road closures with the cycles of the lunar calendar and the mountain solar flares. He used a red pen to mark the years when the department had reported seeing ghost lights on the high summit. The sightings occurred on the exact nights when the road temperature spiked and the ice began to melt from the asphalt. This pattern suggested that the mountain road was acting as a conductor for an energy source that originated deep inside. Silas felt the ground buckle slightly beneath his boots, even though the seismic monitors in the valley remained perfectly still. He realized the asphalt was not just a road, but was a seal placed over a very thin spot in reality. Silas reached out to a retired foreman who had helped pave the mountain pass back in the late 60s. The foreman listened to the description of the steam, and he told Silas to leave the summit before the sun set. The old man whispered that the road was built with a special volcanic aggregate that was supposed to prevent heavy ice. He claimed the stones were taken from a site that the local tribes had warned the engineers to leave alone forever. Silas looked back at the surveyor rod and realized the notches were moving, as if the metal were slowly breathing. Every name listed in the original crew manifest was actually a descendant of the people who once protected the high peaks. Silas found a note in the foreman diary that described a road that leads to a place without time. The surveyor, Elias, was the last person to stand on the summit before the road was officially gated and locked in '88. According to the final report, Elias had discovered that the mountain was not made of solid granite, but of hollow light. Silas realized the man in the red jacket was not a ghost, but was a part of the mountain itself. He received one final shock when he looked at his own GPS and saw his location was listed as sea level. The figure in the red jacket appeared at the edge of the woods and pointed toward the lower valley gate. Silas turned his truck around and drove down the mountain as fast as the black ice would allow him to. He realized that the ordinary mountain road was a bridge that only opened when the cold air hit the peak. Silas packed his gear and decided to report that the road was structurally unsound and should be decommissioned for public use. He called his supervisor to say that the granite was shifting and that the risk of a landslide was high. The supervisor accepted the report without any questions, as if he had been waiting for an excuse to keep it closed. Silas drove away and watched the summit disappear in the fog as the first heavy flakes of the storm fell. He kept the surveyor rod in his truck as a reminder of the man who was still measuring the peaks. He never spoke about the steam or the red jacket to the other inspectors or to the local media. The road remains closed every winter because the mountain needs to finish its work in the silence of the snow. The mystery of the mountain road remains a secret known only to those who have felt the heat of the asphalt. Experts say that the steam is caused by a natural underground spring that warms the rocks during the winter months. Silas knew the difference between a natural spring and a road that was trying to tell him a long story. He lived the rest of his life watching the mountains from the safety of the valley floor and the sun. The forest holds its secrets in the deep snow, and the wind covers the sound of the surveyor at work. The quiet warnings were real, and the road is still waiting for the next storm to open the door. Silas Vance died, knowing that some places on a map are not meant to be traveled by the living. The Department of Transportation eventually reinforced the gates and added a row of heavy concrete barriers to the entrance. They cited geological instability and unpredictable rockfalls as the primary reasons for the permanent closure of the northern pass. Silas often looked at his old field notes and wondered if the surveyor rod was still vibrating in the basement. He had noticed that the serial number on the rod matched the coordinates of the melting circle on the mountain. This suggested that the tools were not just instruments for measuring, but were anchors for a different kind of reality. The red jacket had become a legend among the younger rangers who claimed to see flashes of color in the fog. They spoke of a man who looked through a transit at things that were not yet built in the valley. Historical archives from the county museum revealed that several other roads in the region had been closed for similar reasons. Most of these trails led to ancient quarries where the stones were supposedly restless and warm even in the dead of winter. Silas had suspected that the entire mountain range was connected by a network of energy that the road had accidentally tapped. He spent his final months writing a manuscript that explained the relationship between the blizzard and the magnetic shifting. The pages were filled with diagrams of the surveyor rods and the way they aligned with the stars above. He knew that his work would likely be dismissed as the ramblings of an old man who spent too much time alone. Yet he felt a sense of peace, knowing that he had documented the pattern for the next inspector. Whenever a heavy storm approaches the valley, the residents look up at the dark silhouette of the jagged mountain range. They see the faint glow of the summit, and they know that the road is busy with the work of ghosts. The snow falls in thick blankets that cover the tracks of the man in the red jacket until spring. Silas had left instructions to have his ashes scattered at the base of the ridge near the lower gate. He wanted to be part of the mountain that he had spent so many years trying to understand and map. The road is just a line on a map, but it is also a boundary between the known and the unknown. The gates remain locked, but the measurements continue every single time the temperature drops below the freezing point. The mountain is alive, and it is still waiting for the survey to be finished by the man in red. The night shift report that ended an entire station. The coastal town of Blackwood Bay sat on the edge of a jagged peninsula where the Atlantic Ocean met the rocky shore. A small, automated weather station stood on the highest cliff to monitor the unpredictable wind patterns and rising tides of the northern coast. This station was a critical link for the local fishing fleet because it provided real-time data for navigation during the winter months. For 30 years, the facility operated without a single major incident until a Tuesday in November of 2022. On that night, the station recorded a sequence of data logs that defied every known atmospheric model used by the regional office. Elias Vance was a 48-year-old data analyst who worked for the Maritime Safety Division during that year. His primary job involved reviewing the nightly transmission reports to ensure the sensors remained calibrated against the shifting sea spray. Elias preferred the quiet of the late shift because it allowed him to focus on the subtle rhythms of the ocean sensors. He was a man of meticulous detail who could spot a decimal error in 1,000 lines of raw binary code. On that particular morning, he opened the final report from the Blackwood Bay unit and noticed something that felt fundamentally wrong. The report showed that at exactly 2 o'clock in the morning, the wind speed had dropped to 0 for 10 minutes. Elias knew this was physically impossible for a cliffside location that was constantly battered by the heavy ocean breeze. He checked the secondary sensors for the barometric pressure and saw that the readings had spiked to a record high. The temperature sensor recorded a sudden jump of 40 degrees within a matter of seconds before the entire system went dark. He reached for his coffee and leaned closer to the screen to examine the final archived frames from the lens. The first image showed the familiar view of the dark waves crashing against the base of the granite cliffs below. The second photo captured a strange, shimmering effect in the air that looked like heat rising from a summer pavement. In the third frame, the lens appeared to be melting from the outside in, as if it were exposed to fire. Elias felt a cold knot in his stomach as he realized the station was not malfunctioning due to a software bug. He saw a faint shape in the center of the distortion that looked like a massive metallic hull hovering silently. He checked the internal diagnostic logs and found that the station had attempted to send a high-priority alert. The alert was titled as an unauthorized structural interference, and it had been triggered by an external magnetic pulse. Elias realized that the entire station had been physically neutralized by something that did not want to be tracked. He printed the logs and immediately called the director of the regional maritime office to report a critical failure. The director listened to the description of the melted hardware and ordered an immediate evacuation of the cliffside area. When the recovery team reached the site the next morning, they found the steel pole had been twisted like wire. The weather station housing was a blackened husk, and the solar panels had been shattered into thousands of tiny glass shards. There were no footprints in the mud and no signs of a physical explosion or a localized lightning strike. The investigators found a thin layer of iridescent dust covering the ruins of the equipment that vibrated with a low hum. They gathered samples of the dust and the warped metal to send to a specialized lab for further chemical analysis. The laboratory report confirmed that the metal had been subjected to a localized gravitational force of extreme intensity. The dust contained isotopes that were not consistent with any naturally occurring minerals found on the northern Atlantic coast. The official investigation concluded that a rare atmospheric phenomenon had caused a freak electrical discharge that destroyed the sensitive electronics. Elias read the final summary and knew that the researchers were simply trying to avoid a much larger conversation. He kept a digital copy of the original night shift report on an encrypted drive at his private home. The Maritime Safety Division decided to decommission the Blackwood Bay Station permanently after the incident was fully processed. They claimed the terrain was too unstable to support a new facility and moved the equipment to a safer harbor. The cliff remained empty, and the locals avoided the area because of the strange lights seen during the new moon. Elias retired from his position 6 months later and moved to a small cabin far away from the coast. He never spoke to the press about the melted lens or the silent hull in the final photograph. The night shift report remained a classified file that was buried deep within the archives of the Regional Safety Office. It served as a silent testimony to the moment a routine observation turned into a brush with the unknown. No one ever explained how a windless 10 minutes could lead to the complete physical erasure of a station. Elias often looks at the stars and wonders if the sensors are still recording things that people refuse to see. The ocean continues to roar against the cliffs, but the silence of that night still echoes in the data. The mystery of Blackwood Bay began to circulate among the small community of deep-sea fishermen and local lighthouse keepers. They spoke in hushed tones about the way the birds stopped singing in the hours leading up to the event. Old logs from 20 years prior suggested that similar magnetic anomalies had been recorded by merchant ships passing through the area. Elias spent his retirement cataloging these historical mentions and comparing them to the data on his encrypted drive. He found that every 12 years, the atmospheric pressure in the bay underwent a massive and unexplained shift. This pattern suggested that the event in 2022 was not an isolated incident of mechanical failure. It pointed toward a recurring presence that operated on a schedule far beyond the understanding of local authorities. The iridescent dust samples that Elias had secretly kept in a small glass vial began to glow faintly at night. He noticed that the vibrations from the dust would synchronize with the tide cycles of the distant Atlantic shore. This discovery led him to believe that whatever had destroyed the station was still present beneath the deep waves. The regional office eventually removed all mentions of the Blackwood Bay unit from their public-facing maps and websites. They replaced the data stream with a generic feed from a station located 40 miles further south in a harbor. This move ensured that the public would not notice the massive hole in the monitoring grid during the winter storms. Elias realized that the erasure of the station was a deliberate attempt to hide a truth that was too heavy. He continued to monitor the local radio frequencies from his cabin using a modified long-range antenna and a laptop. One night in late December, he picked up a signal that mirrored the frequency recorded during the final minutes of the station. The sound was a rhythmic pulsing that resembled a heartbeat transmitted through a thick layer of static and ocean noise. Elias recorded the signal and realized it was coming from the exact coordinates of the abandoned cliffside facility. He drove back to the coast one last time to see if anything had changed in the years since the event. The site was fenced off with heavy chain link and signs warning the public about unstable geological conditions. He stood by the fence and looked out toward the dark horizon, where the ocean met the sky in a line. The air felt heavy with the same static charge that he had seen in the photographs from the night shift report. A single light flickered far out at sea, where no buoy or ship was supposed to be stationed that evening. Elias knew that the story of the weather station was only the beginning of a much larger and darker narrative. He turned away from the cliff and drove back into the night, leaving the secrets of the bay behind. The truth about what happened on that Tuesday in November remains locked away in boxes of redacted paperwork and broken parts. The people of Blackwood Bay continue their lives while the phantom of the night shift report hangs over the coast. It is a reminder that some things are captured by the lens that are never meant to be understood by humans. Elias continues to keep his watch from a distance, knowing that the sensors will eventually trigger another silent alarm. The silence of the ocean is never truly empty when the machines are the only ones left to listen. The strange events linked to a winter motel. The isolated stretch of highway leading toward the northern peaks remained a silent witness to the brutal winters of the territory. A single automated security camera sat perched atop a weathered steel pole near the remote boundary of a roadside motel. This specific device was programmed to take a high-resolution photograph every 60 seconds to monitor the vacant parking area. Local law enforcement rarely checked the digital archives unless a significant incident or a missing traveler was reported in the area. On a Tuesday in January of 2022, the camera recorded a sequence of images that seemed entirely ordinary. Silas Thorne was a 42-year-old maintenance technician who worked for the Regional Department of Transportation during that year. His primary job involved traveling to remote locations to ensure that solar panels and data transmitters were functioning within parameters. Silas enjoyed the solitude of his work because it allowed him to explore the rugged landscape far from the city noise. On that particular morning, he received a notification that a specific camera unit was experiencing a strange recurring storage error. He packed his tools into his white utility truck and began the long drive toward the isolated mountain pass corridor. The drive took nearly 3 hours, and the fog hung low over the dense canopy of ancient cedar and fir. Silas reached the base of the pole and connected his rugged laptop to the diagnostic port located inside the box. He noticed that the hard drive was almost full of temporary files that should have been deleted automatically every month. The system was lagging because it was struggling to process a series of photographs taken during a recent heavy snow. Silas decided to download the final batch of images before he cleared the memory and reset the internal software. As the progress bar moved across his screen, he scrolled through the thumbnails to ensure the lens was still focused. He saw the familiar gray pavement and the blurred shapes of passing cars that moved through the frame at speeds. One image from 3 nights prior caught his eye because the background lighting looked different from the photos around. A small white sedan was parked on the narrow shoulder of the road just past the edge of the motel. The car had its hazard lights on, and the driver's side door was left standing wide open toward the forest. Silas felt a slight chill, because that section of the highway was known for having absolutely no cellular phone service. He clicked on the next photo in the sequence to see if the driver was standing near the vehicle alone. The white sedan was still there, but the open door was now closed, and a dark figure stood near the trunk. The figure appeared to be reaching into the dense brush, and it was pulling something heavy out from the shadows. Silas zoomed in on the grainy pixels until he could see the silhouette of a large and dusty camping trunk. He checked the timestamps and realized that the person had been at that specific location for less than 5 minutes. The third photo showed the white sedan pulling back onto the asphalt and leaving nothing but tire tracks in the mud. Silas looked toward the actual spot on the shoulder and saw that the grass was still flattened near the trees. He felt a strange urge to investigate the area, even though his primary task for the day was already finished. He stepped over the metal guardrail and walked toward the exact place where the figure had stood in the photograph. The ground was soft from the recent rains, and he noticed deep gouges in the earth where something was dragged. He followed the trail for about 50 feet until he reached a small clearing hidden behind a thicket of ferns. Silas found the camping trunk tucked under a pile of damp pine needles and heavy branches that looked intentionally placed. He reached down to touch the cold plastic surface and saw that the heavy latches were sealed with tape. A faint smell of metallic decay hung in the stagnant air, and Silas immediately pulled his hand back in realization. He used his radio to contact the dispatch office and reported that he had discovered a suspicious item in woods. Within an hour, 2 state troopers arrived at the scene and began to secure the perimeter with yellow plastic tape. They asked Silas to show them the photographs on his laptop so they could identify the time and the place. The officers noted that the white sedan did not have a visible rear license plate in any of the frames. They carefully cut the tape on the trunk and discovered several stolen historical artifacts from a local museum storage facility. The museum had reported a quiet break-in 3 months earlier, but the investigators had no leads on the items. These artifacts were extremely valuable, and the thieves had likely hidden them in the forest until the heat died. The police realized the driver must have returned to the woods to move the cache to a more permanent location. They analyzed the road camera data from other units along the highway to track the path of the car. This lead eventually took them to a small rental property located 2 towns over from the edge of the park. Inside the house, the authorities found more items that had been taken during the same heist earlier that same year. The suspects had been living there under false names while they waited for a buyer to finalize a secret sale. One of the men was a former security guard who knew exactly how to avoid the primary surveillance systems. He did not realize that the remote traffic camera was set to trigger every minute regardless of any motion. His simple mistake of parking in that specific spot had provided the only evidence needed to solve the entire case. Silas returned to his office that afternoon and felt a sense of pride for paying attention to the small details. Most people would have deleted the corrupted files without looking at the images because it was a routine maintenance job. The Winter Motel was now clear of the mystery, and the historical treasures were returned to their rightful cases. He continued his work across the mountains and always looked a little closer at the photos from the lonely road. Sometimes the most important things are hidden in the background of a world that is always moving too fast. The automated camera still stands on its steel pole and records the passage of time one frame at a time. It captures the fog and the trees and the occasional car that travels through the silence of the deep woods. No one ever suspects that a simple machine could be the most important witness to a crime in the wilderness. Silas knows that every photograph tells a story if someone is willing to take the time to look. He drives the highway with a new perspective and watches the shadows for anything else the lens might catch. Final footage from the camera reportedly showed that the suspects had used the motel as a temporary landmark for their activities. Witness statements gathered later mentioned a white sedan frequenting the area during the hours after midnight when the highway was empty. Dispatch logs confirmed that no service calls had been placed from that vicinity for over 48 hours before the find. The investigation concluded that the thieves had intended to smuggle the artifacts across the northern border by the end of winter. This case remains a prominent example of how routine data maintenance can expose secrets hidden in plain sight for years. The recovered items were documented in archived calls between the museum and the Regional Recovery Task Force as being priceless. Silas often thinks about the moment the progress bar reached 100% and the thumbnail first appeared on his screen. The cold air of the mountain pass still carries the memory of that day when a machine captured the truth. He continues to maintain the network of cameras with a diligence that ensures no detail is ever truly lost. The forest remains quiet now, but the record of the Winter Motel is preserved in the Regional Safety Archives. The story of the stolen artifacts serves as a reminder of the historical significance buried within the small mountain towns. Students now visit the museum to see the displays that were nearly lost to the black market forever. The regional board implemented new protocols to review all storage errors manually to prevent similar incidents from going unnoticed. Silas is often cited in training sessions as the primary example of a technician who performed his duty with excellence. The highway continues to wind through the pines, and the camera continues to click in the silence of the night. Every minute, a new frame is added to the digital history of the Northern Corridor for the safety of all. The record of the world grows steadily as the machines watch over the lonely places where humans rarely venture alone. Silas knows that the truth is always there, waiting to be found by someone with the patience to look closely. The mystery of the Winter Motel is solved, but the watch over the mountain highway will never truly come to an end. The silence of the pines is now filled with the knowledge that the past is finally safe and secure. Why investigators stopped searching this forest trail? Search and rescue logs from the summer of 1994 contain several redacted entries regarding a popular hiking trail. These official documents mention a series of unexplained events that forced local authorities to permanently close the entire wooded area to the public. Silas Thorne was a 48-year-old forest ranger who spent his career patrolling the rugged northern ridgelines in the park. He was a practical man who understood the dangers of the wilderness and respected the unpredictable nature of the high mountains. Silas lived in a small cabin near the park entrance and kept a detailed journal of every unusual sighting he encountered. One humid morning in August, he received a report about a group of hikers who had vanished near the valley stream. The trail was a well-marked path that thousands of people used every single year without any major safety concerns. He packed his medical kit and checked his topographical maps to plan a search route through the dense green forest. Silas drove his government truck to the trailhead and noticed that the morning birds were unusually quiet in the heavy air. He reported his position to the station and mentioned that a thick fog was starting to settle over the lower valley. A strange metallic humming sound coming from the trees made him pause as he adjusted his heavy nylon backpack straps. He looked toward the thick brush, but the sound was not coming from any mechanical equipment or known service vehicles. Silas continued down the dirt path and noticed that the trail markers had been moved from their original wooden posts. He saw a bright orange ribbon tied to a branch that led deep into a section of the woods labeled off limits. The ranger decided to follow the ribbon to see if the missing hikers had wandered into the dangerous rocky terrain. The forest became incredibly dark as the trees grew closer together, and the sun was blocked by the thick canopy. He looked at his compass and realized the needle was spinning in rapid circles without pointing toward the North Pole. Silas stopped walking and noticed that his heavy boots were leaving deep indentations in the soil that glowed with purple light. The glowing soil started to vibrate as a low-frequency pulse echoed through the floor of the quiet, dark forest. Silas checked his emergency radio for a signal, but the device only produced a series of rhythmic and high clicks. He knew that the local geology was not capable of producing magnetic interference of this specific and intense magnitude. The clicks on the radio stopped, and a voice began to whisper a set of names that sounded familiar to him. Silas grabbed his official logbook and realized the names belonged to people who had gone missing in 1972. He looked at the trees and saw that the bark had been carved with hundreds of small and intricate geometric patterns. The ranger followed the carvings until he reached a clearing where the trees had been pushed by an incredible force. He saw a white tent standing in the center of the clearing that appeared to be brand new and very clean. The tent was unoccupied, but the interior was filled with rows of glass jars that contained different types of soil. Silas stepped inside the tent and saw a small table with a silver tray holding a collection of silver rings. Each ring had a date engraved on the inside that matched the years of the most famous local missing cases. Silas realized that these items were not left behind by hikers, but were being displayed as a specific collection. He found a handheld recorder on the table that was actively capturing the sounds of the forest outside the white tent. Silas pressed the playback button and heard a recording of his own truck arriving at the trailhead recently. The recording included the sound of him speaking into his radio about the thick fog and the quiet birds today. He felt a sharp pain in his chest as a bright flash of light filled the small and white tent. Silas ran out of the tent and scrambled back toward the main trail as the ground began to shake. He reached his truck and drove toward the ranger station without stopping to check for the missing hikers again. Silas told his supervisor about the glowing soil and the silver rings and the strange recordings in the woods. The supervisor looked at the maps and told Silas that the clearing he described did not exist on any survey. A team of 20 investigators returned to the forest trail the following morning to search for any signs of the tent. They found the orange ribbon and the spinning compasses, but the clearing was nothing but a wall of trees. There was no glowing soil and no white tent and no collection of silver rings in the area. The lead investigator looked at Silas and asked if he had been experiencing any symptoms of heat stroke. Silas pulled a single silver ring from his pocket to prove that he had actually been inside the tent. He opened his hand, but the ring had turned into a piece of brittle wood that crumbled into dust. The authorities decided to stop the search and permanently closed the forest trail to protect the public from events. Silas resigned from the Forest Service and moved to a coastal town where there were no trees at all. He kept his original journal, but the pages describing that day were now completely blank and smelled like ozone. He realized that the things he saw in the forest were part of a cycle that repeated often. Silas never went hiking again because he knew that some trails lead to places that do not exist. The forest trail remains closed to this day and is heavily patrolled by private security teams in uniforms. Construction crews tried to pave over the area in 2012, but their heavy machinery failed every time. No records of the missing hikers were ever found in the state archives, and their families stopped asking questions. Silas Thorne lived the rest of his life in silence and never spoke about the glowing purple soil again. Some mysteries are buried so deep in the woods that they are better left for the trees to guard. The truth about why they stopped searching remains hidden under the thick canopy and the silence of the ridge. Silas often wondered if the recordings he heard were being played for someone else who had entered the woods. He knew the forest had its own way of reclaiming the things that people tried to document and report. The strange frequency that he heard on the radio was never detected by any other official equipment in the park. The trail is now overgrown with thorns and heavy brush that makes it nearly impossible for anyone to pass. Local legends say that the birds still go silent whenever the fog begins to roll in from the north. Silas left his journal to the local historical society, but the specific entries about the white tent were gone. Investigators eventually stopped visiting the site after several members of the security team reported hearing voices in the static. The state government removed the trail from all modern maps to ensure that no curious travelers would get lost. The case of the vanishing hikers from 1994 was officially listed as an unsolved wilderness accident. Silas Thorne died knowing that the collection in the white tent was likely still growing with every passing cycle. The woods remain a place where the rules of the world do not always apply to those who enter. His footprints from that day were reported to have faded within minutes of his escape from the clearing. Internal reports suggested that radiation levels in the closed area stayed above normal for several years following the event. Witnesses from nearby towns occasionally report seeing pulsing lights appearing behind the trees when the moon is high. No new investigation has been launched due to fear of what might be rediscovered in the dark of the woods. Silas often sat on the pier of his coastal home, staring at the ocean and wondering about the others. He knew that human memory is a fragile thing that can be easily changed by forces we do not understand. The brown dust from the wooden ring remained in a small jar on his mantle as a silent reminder. Events at the Northern Forest Trail will never be fully reported to avoid mass panic in the general region. Local residents still talk about the disappearances when they gather at the old coffee shop on the edge of town. They know that parts of the mountain do not want to be disturbed by human presence or technology. The secret of 1994 is locked behind the chain-link fence that now surrounds the forest area. Silas Thorne took the secret of the radio whispers to his grave without ever sharing them with anyone. The trees will continue to grow and cover all physical evidence until nothing is left but a fading legend. Whenever the wind blows hard from the north, people remember the last warning written by the forest ranger. Do not follow the orange ribbons that do not lead you back home because the woods have their collection. This story ends as a reminder that the wilderness still holds dark corners that we will never truly master. The purple light Silas saw beneath his feet was perhaps a sign of something older than human history itself. The area is now a dead zone for all modern communication signals, and no satellite can take clear images. The forest has swallowed the past and the future into a single entity that cannot be pierced by logic. Silas Thorne went in peace, but his eyes always turned toward the north as if he were waiting. The mystery of the forest trail will remain part of the darkest secrets of the earth among the trees. The truth the investigators sought was ultimately just a reflection of their own fear of the deep unknown. The popular hiking trail is now just a name in an old document that is yellowing and fading. The silence there is a type of silence that speaks of things that are better left unheard or unseen. New rangers are now given strict instructions to avoid the perimeter fence without asking any medical or operational questions. The path that was once full of families and laughter is now reclaimed by a darkness that refuses to leave. Silas knew that the collection of rings was just a small part of a much larger and darker truth. The world is much stranger than the maps lead us to believe when we walk under the ancient trees. In this new story, archived incident logs mention a remote ranger station where the final recorded footage surfaced during a massive January blizzard that cut power across several mountain routes. The footage appeared normal at first, yet investigators noted abrupt audio distortions moments before the feed ended. Locals still mention the event when storms roll through that region. Darren Morrow, a 38-year-old seasonal ranger, arrived at the station shortly after noon to prepare for worsening conditions. His assignment involved monitoring trail beacons and checking radio towers before the storm blocked access. He expected a long shift because the blizzard warning described unusually fast-moving cloud bands capable of burying vehicles within minutes. He carried a thermos of coffee, his logbook, and an old camcorder used for final checks before each closure. Snowfall increased as he hiked the short path leading to the outpost. The cabin-sized station stood on a ridge overlooking a frozen valley. Wind pushed against its wooden frame, which creaked with each gust. He unlocked the door, then stepped inside while his boots scattered snow across the floorboards. The air felt colder than usual, which suggested the old furnace struggled to keep up with incoming wind. He wrote a note about adding extra insulation during the next supply run. Darren began recording a standard check-in message for the regional office. The camcorder rested on a small tripod that faced the desk and radio console. As he spoke, he heard faint rattling outside, which might have been ice sliding off the roof. The footage captured him turning toward the window briefly before returning to his report. He mentioned the storm pattern shifting earlier than forecast, which matched updates from nearby stations. After finishing the recording, he stepped outside to secure loose items, since strong gusts sometimes pulled equipment down the slope. He fastened the shutters, tightened the fuel drums, and checked the tower base for cracks caused by freezing moisture. The wind cut at his jacket, which forced him to work quickly. Far below, he noticed faint lights flickering along the tree line. He assumed the lights came from hikers rushing toward shelter despite posted warnings. He tried raising nearby patrol teams on the radio, yet static overwhelmed the signal. He switched frequencies and heard fragmented voices that cut out mid-sentence. He made a note in his log about interference likely caused by atmospheric distortion. Snow began falling sideways, which signaled the blizzard center approaching faster than predicted. He retreated to the station as visibility worsened until the valley vanished behind gray walls of wind. Inside, he sealed the door and activated the exterior floodlights. The beams barely pierced the storm, yet illuminated swirling sheets of snow. The camcorder still rested on the desk, which blinked with a low battery warning. He replaced the battery, then recorded another clip describing the radio disruption and increasing wind speed. Midway through the message, the cabin door rattled sharply as if someone pushed from outside. Darren grabbed his flashlight and approached the door cautiously. He called anyone out there, but the blizzard swallowed his voice. He opened the door slightly, though the wind forced it against him. A shadow shifted near the propane tank, then vanished behind a curtain of drifting snow. He scanned the area for movement, but saw only storm waves rolling across the ridge. He closed the door firmly and logged the incident because shadows near the tank often meant wildlife searching for warmth. Minutes later, the radio crackled with a distorted tone, followed by a faint voice repeating the word northbound. The message sounded strained and clipped, as if the speaker were fighting heavy wind. Darren responded but heard no reply. He adjusted the range and tried again until only static filled the room. The camcorder recorded him staring at the console while the wind shook the building steadily. He stepped away to check the furnace since the temperature dropped several degrees. The old system clattered like metal plates shifting under strain. He opened the access panel and tapped the ductwork lightly, which helped clear condensation. A low vibration traveled through the floorboards, which made him pause. The vibration felt steady and too uniform for random wind. He checked beneath the sink and along the support beams for structural shifts, but found nothing. Outside, the floodlights flickered as if something obstructed them. The storm intensified, which caused the beams to pulse irregularly. He approached the window and saw brief flashes of orange light along the ridge. The lights moved in a slow pattern like markers following a path through the blizzard. He whispered, "No one should be out there," because the route near the ridge closed hours earlier. Darren put on his gear and stepped outside despite the punishing wind. He moved a few feet from the cabin before the storm nearly pushed him sideways. He braced himself against the railing and scanned the ridge for the orange lights, yet they faded instantly. Snow whipped across his face in dense sheets, which forced him to retreat inside. He shook off ice and placed his gloves near the furnace to thaw. The camcorder recorded him pacing between the window and radio console. The audio captured faint thumps from the roof, which sounded heavier than falling ice. He grabbed a long-handled broom and tapped the ceiling in several spots to dislodge buildup. More thumps echoed, which made him lower the broom slowly. He wrote another entry in his log describing rhythmic impacts not caused by tree limbs or loose panels. Storm pressure increased until the station walls groaned steadily. The camcorder captured a brief flicker of the lights, followed by darkness. Emergency lanterns activated automatically, which cast the room in a dim amber glow. The radio emitted a harsh frequency spike, then cut off completely. Darren pulled the backup receiver from a metal case and attempted contact again, yet no channels reached through the storm. A sharp knock hit the door, which startled him enough to step back. He called, "Identify yourself," yet only the wind answered. He approached the peephole and saw nothing except swirling white. When he unlatched the top bolt, a second, harder strike hit the frame. He shut the bolt quickly while breathing heavily. He checked the window, yet the ridge remained invisible within the storm. He reviewed the exterior camera feed connected to a small monitor near the desk. The screen showed distorted snow patterns and brief static bursts. He switched angles until one camera displayed a dark shape hovering near the propane tank. The shape moved out of frame before the feed failed entirely. He reached for his coat again, but decided against stepping outside after remembering the collapsing visibility. The floor vibrated once more as if heavy machinery operated underground. The station had no subterranean structures, which made the sensation more concerning. He steadied himself while writing in the log about the vibration lasting longer than earlier ones. The camcorder captured the moment the station lights flickered again, while a faint metallic hum filled the room. Darren turned toward the window when a sudden flash illuminated the ridge. The flash looked like a flare, yet burned too quickly to match standard emergency equipment. He moved closer until the vibration intensified. Snow along the windowsill shook loose, which signaled a stronger tremor under the cabin. He grabbed the radio microphone and attempted one final call. The transmission failed mid-sentence, which caused the radio to emit a shrill tone. The camcorder picked up the moment he dropped the microphone and reached for the breaker panel. He reset the switches, though the storm overpowered the system instantly. He shut the panel and stepped back when the knock returned to the door with a deep, hollow sound. He called out again, but received no reply. His voice cracked with fear, which rarely happened during his long years at remote posts. He prepared to secure the shutters when the propane tank outside let out a sharp pop caused by sudden pressure change. He rushed to the window, yet could not see through the frozen glass. He scraped frost away and saw faint movement near the tank, but the blizzard distorted everything into shapes he could not identify. The camcorder recorded the room shaking twice before a heavy impact landed against the wall facing the ridge. The lanterns wavered as another vibration traveled through the floor. Darren grabbed the emergency flare gun and aimed it at the door, even though firing inside would be dangerous. He backed toward the desk while keeping his eyes on the entrance. A final burst of wind slammed against the station, which caused the camcorder tripod to wobble. The camera tilted slightly as Darren shouted something partly drowned by the storm. The feed captured one last frame of him turning toward the window when a brilliant light filled the room for a split second. The video ended abruptly as the camera lost power. Rescue teams reached the station 2 days later after the blizzard subsided. They found the structure partially buried and the door forced inward by snow pressure. Darren's gear remained inside, yet he was missing. The propane tank showed signs of rapid freezing, then sudden expansion. Survey crews noted unusual ground disturbances near the ridge, though no modern machinery was found. Authorities recovered the camcorder near the desk, where it had fallen during the final minutes. Forensic review confirmed no tampering and no clear explanation for the final light captured on the feed. Audio analysis detected low-frequency vibrations matching subsoil shifts often recorded near unstable terrain, though the ridge showed no signs of collapse. Locals believe the ridge amplifies storm pressure, which creates strange lights and sounds. Some claim older tunnels exist beneath the station, built during a forgotten project, though no records confirm their purpose. Others think the flashes are atmospheric arcs triggered by intense blizzard conditions. Darren's disappearance remains an unsolved entry in the regional archive. Each January, rangers at nearby posts mention hearing faint vibrations during heavy storms. They sometimes report flickering lights near the ridge, which vanish before verification. The station still stands as a supply shelter, though it remains unstaffed during deep winter. Footage from that final night remains part of training sessions for new rangers. In those recordings, Darren's voice grows strained as each vibration grows stronger. The storm outside presses against the walls like a living presence. The video ends before any clear answer appears, which leaves viewers with the same uncertainty investigators faced. Snow still buries the ridge each winter. Wind still carves deep whirls near the outpost. Travelers who pass through the area during storms sometimes hear faint knocking carried through the cold air. Most dismiss the sound as shifting ice, though a few believe the ridge holds more than wind and snow. They mention Darren's final footage, which captures a moment where something pressed close to the station during a blizzard that erased nearly all visibility except for one last flash that no one has ever explained.